I paid my parents' mortgage for 7 years, believing I was doing the right thing for the people who raised me. Then I accidentally saw their estate planning documents. Every single asset, including the house I had secretly been keeping out of foreclosure, was being left to my older brother, so I completely cut them off. A month later, my mother texted me. No hello, no asking how my day was. Just 4 demanding words. The mortgage is due. I simply replied, ask the sole heir. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with a family member who took advantage of your success. My name is Jasmine. I am 35 years old, and I run one of the top crisis public relations firms in downtown Atlanta. My life is spent putting out fires for high-profile clients, managing scandals, and controlling narratives. I am very good at staying calm under pressure. Growing up in a middle-class African-American family in Georgia, I had to learn how to keep my composure. My parents, Brenda and Calvin, always made sure I knew my place. I was the reliable one, the workhorse, the daughter who was expected to quietly succeed and cheerfully fund the family, while all their emotional and financial energy went to my older brother, Terrence. Terrence was the undisputed golden child of the family. While I built my business from the ground up through grueling 80-hour work weeks, Terrence was a serial entrepreneur whose ventures always miraculously failed just when he needed our parents to bail him out. He was charismatic, loud, and entirely convinced of his own superiority, a trait heavily encouraged by my parents and fully supported by his entitled white wife, Brittany. Brittany loved to make subtle digs at my single status at family dinners, completely oblivious to the fact that my hard-earned money was subsidizing the very parents who were subsidizing her comfortable suburban lifestyle. It was a Tuesday morning. The Atlanta skyline was bright and clear outside my floor-to-ceiling office windows. I was sipping my second coffee and reviewing a mitigation strategy for a corporate client when my personal cell phone buzzed on the glass desk. The screen lit up with a message from my mother, Brenda. The mortgage is due. Where's the transfer? $3,500. That was the amount I had been quietly wiring to her account on the first of every month for the past 7 years. There was never any gratitude. There was never a thank you card or even a text asking if I was healthy or happy. There was just the cold, hard expectation that the Bank of Jasmine was always open and fully funded. But after what I had discovered at their house during Sunday dinner the week before, everything had changed. I had walked into my father's home office to grab a pen and saw the estate planning documents lying wide open on his desk. The paperwork was perfectly clear. The fully paid-off house, which was only paid off because of me, was going 100% to Terrence to secure his family legacy. I picked up my phone. I did not type out a long explanation. I did not ask for an apology or express my deep, profound hurt. I simply typed 4 words and hit send. Ask the sole heir. The reaction was instantaneous. Within 10 seconds, my phone began vibrating continuously across my desk. First, it was my mother calling twice in a row. Then my father, Calvin, called. I watched their names flash on the screen, feeling a strange new sense of liberation as I let every single call roll to voicemail. I picked up my pen and went back to my client file, refusing to let their panic disrupt my morning. 5 minutes later, a different ringtone cut through the quiet of my office. It was Terrence. I decided to answer. I pressed the speaker button and leaned back in my leather chair. Jasmine, what is wrong with you? Terrence barked immediately, not bothering with a greeting. Mom is in hysterics. What kind of disrespectful game are you playing with their mortgage? I am not playing anything, Terrence, I replied, my voice perfectly level. I am simply stepping back. Since Dad felt it was completely appropriate to leave the entire family estate to you to secure your legacy, I figured you should be the one carrying the financial burden of that estate. You are being a bitter, jealous spinster. He spat back, his voice echoing in my spacious office. You think because you have this little PR hobby that you can disrespect this family. You owe Mom and Dad. You owe this family respect. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip before responding. Respect does not pay a $3,500 mortgage, Terrence, but I am sure your legacy will cover it. I reached over and tapped the button to end the call, cutting off whatever insult he was preparing to hurl next. I exhaled, feeling the residual adrenaline fading. I thought that would be the end of it for the day. I had a critical lunch meeting scheduled in 20 minutes with a prospective client at the upscale French bistro located on the ground floor of my office building. I gathered my files and my designer handbag, preparing to shift my focus entirely back to my career. Just as I stood up, the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was my executive assistant, her voice tight with a mixture of professional restraint and underlying alarm. "Jasmine, I am so sorry to interrupt," she said quickly, "but your parents just barged past the lobby security downstairs. They are demanding to see you, and they are marching directly into the bistro where your client is waiting." I paid my parents' mortgage for 7 years, believing I was doing the honorable thing for the people who raised me. That was until a careless mistake exposed the absolute truth. I accidentally saw their newly drafted estate planning documents. Every single asset, including the house I had secretly been keeping out of foreclosure, was being left entirely to my older brother. So I completely closed my checkbook and waited. Exactly 1 month later, my mother texted me. No hello, no asking how my day was, just 4 demanding words. "The mortgage is due." I simply replied, "Ask the sole heir." If you have ever had to set a hard boundary with a family member who took advantage of your success, stay with me. Let me know where you are tuning in from and hit that subscribe button because you will want to hear how this family reckoning played out. I sat in my corner office in downtown Atlanta. The skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, serving as a daily testament to the life I had built entirely on my own. At 35, I ran one of the most ruthless crisis public relations firms in the city. My daily routine consisted of putting out massive fires for high-profile clients and controlling disastrous narratives. I knew exactly how to stay calm under intense pressure. Growing up in a middle-class African-American family in Georgia, I had no choice but to learn how to keep my composure. My parents, Brenda and Calvin, always made sure I knew my place. I was the reliable one, the workhorse, the daughter who was expected to quietly succeed and cheerfully fund the family, while all their emotional and financial energy went to my older brother Terrence. Terrence was the undisputed golden child of the family. While I built my business from the ground up through grueling 80-hour work weeks, Terrence was a serial entrepreneur whose ventures always miraculously failed just when he needed our parents to bail him out. He was charismatic, loud, and entirely convinced of his own superiority. It was a trait heavily encouraged by my parents and fully supported by his highly entitled white wife, Brittany. Brittany loved to make subtle, condescending digs at my single status at family dinners, completely oblivious to the fact that my hard-earned money was subsidizing the very parents who were subsidizing her comfortable suburban lifestyle. It was a Tuesday morning. The Atlanta skyline was bright and clear outside my office windows. I was sipping my coffee and reviewing a mitigation strategy for a corporate client when my personal cell phone buzzed on the glass desk. The screen lit up with a message from my mother, Brenda. "The mortgage is due. Where is the transfer?" $3,500. That was the amount I had been quietly wiring to her account on the first of every month for the past 7 years. There was never any gratitude. There was never a thank you card. There was just the cold, hard expectation that the Bank of Jasmine was always open and fully funded. But after what I had discovered at their house during Sunday dinner the week before, everything had changed. I had walked into my father's home office to grab a pen and saw the estate planning documents lying wide open on his desk. The paperwork was perfectly clear. The fully paid-off house, which was only paid off because of me, was going 100% to Terrence to secure his family legacy. I picked up my phone. I did not type out a long explanation. I did not ask for an apology or express my deep, profound hurt. I simply typed 4 words and hit send. Ask the sole heir. The reaction was instantaneous. Within 10 seconds, my phone began vibrating continuously across my desk. First, it was my mother calling twice in a row. Then my father Calvin called. I watched their names flash on the screen, feeling a strange new sense of liberation as I let every single call roll to voicemail. I picked up my pen and went back to my client file, refusing to let their panic disrupt my morning. 5 minutes later, a different ringtone cut through the quiet of my office. It was Terrence. I decided to answer. I pressed the speaker button and leaned back in my leather chair. Jasmine. What is wrong with you? Terrence barked immediately, not bothering with a greeting. Mom is in hysterics. What kind of disrespectful game are you playing with their mortgage? I'm not playing anything, Terrence. I replied, my voice perfectly level. I am simply stepping back. Since Dad felt it was completely appropriate to leave the entire family estate to you to secure your legacy, I figured you should be the one carrying the financial burden of that estate. You are being a bitter, jealous spinster. He spat back, his voice echoing in my spacious office. You think because you have this little PR hobby that you can disrespect this family. You owe Mom and Dad. You owe this family respect. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip before responding. Respect does not pay a $3,500 mortgage, Terrence. But I am sure your legacy will cover it. I reached over and tapped the button to end the call, cutting off whatever insult he was preparing to hurl next. I exhaled, feeling the residual adrenaline fading. I thought that would be the end of it for the day. I had a critical lunch meeting scheduled in 20 minutes with a prospective client at the upscale French bistro located on the ground floor of my office building. I gathered my files and my designer handbag, preparing to shift my focus entirely back to my career. Just as I stood up, the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was my executive assistant, her voice tight with a mixture of professional restraint and underlying alarm. Jasmine, I am so sorry to interrupt, she said quickly, but your parents just barged past the lobby security downstairs. They are demanding to see you, and they are marching directly into the bistro where your client is waiting. I moved faster than I ever have in heels. I rushed out of the elevator and intercepted my parents in the bistro lobby just before they could reach my client's table. The hostess, a young woman I knew well, looked absolutely terrified. Calvin stood there with his chest puffed out in his tailored suit, while Brenda glared at me with an expression of pure fury. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to pull them into a private corner and cave to their demands just to keep the peace. Calvin slammed his hand hard on the hostess stand, making the reservation binder jump. You are going to transfer that money right now, Jasmine, he demanded, his voice booming through the elegant entryway. I will not have you disrespecting your mother. I will make a scene right here in front of these people if you do not fix this. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, crossing my arms and looking him squarely in the face. Go ahead, Dad, I challenged him, keeping my voice steady and low. Make a scene. Tell everyone in this restaurant how your 35-year-old daughter pays your bills. Tell them how I saw the estate planning documents you carelessly left open on your desk after Sunday dinner. Tell them how the fully paid-off house, the one I saved from foreclosure, is going 100% to Terrence to secure the family legacy. Brenda gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She instantly shifted from aggressive to defensive, loudly justifying their betrayal. Terrence needs that house, she proclaimed, her voice shrill enough to turn heads at the nearby tables. Terrence has Brittany and 3 growing boys to provide for. You are 35 and single. You just work all day. You do not need a house, Jasmine. You have a perfectly nice apartment. Her words hung in the air, a crystal-clear confirmation of everything I had always known, but never wanted to admit. In their eyes, I was not a daughter to be cherished or protected. I was a utility. I was a resource to be drained so that Terrence could play the role of the successful patriarch. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, seeing the absolute entitlement radiating from her posture. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my corporate credit card. I handed it to the wide-eyed hostess. Please open a tab for my client at table 4 and cover whatever they order today, I instructed her softly. Then I turned my attention back to my parents, looking my father dead in the eye. The Bank of Jasmine is permanently closed, I stated, letting each word drop like a stone. I am not funding your lives anymore. Have fun with the foreclosure. I spun on my heel and walked out of the bistro, leaving them stammering and speechless in the lobby. The crisp Atlanta air hit my face as I marched toward the valet stand where my car was parked. I felt a tremendous weight lifting off my shoulders, but I knew my family would not surrender that easily. As I slid into the driver's seat of my car, my phone delivered an emergency alert notification. It was from my private wealth manager. I opened the message and felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. Someone had just attempted to use my social security number to authorize a hard credit pull for a $90,000 luxury SUV at a dealership across town. It was Terrence. He had memorized my information years ago when I co-signed his very first apartment lease, a lease he naturally defaulted on. He actually thought he could buy a luxury car under my name while I was busy dealing with our parents. Instead of calling the police in a blind panic, I smiled. A dark, calculated smile. They really thought I was just going to roll over and take this. They forgot what I do for a living. I destroy liabilities. I immediately contacted my wealth manager, instructing him to freeze my credit across all bureaus and file a formal fraud alert. That would instantly block Terrence at the dealership, leaving him humiliated and stranded at the financing desk. But I was not finished. I pulled my iPad out of my work bag right there in the driver's seat. I logged into the master family accounts that I had been paying for a decade. With a few swift taps on the screen, I systematically severed their lifelines. I canceled the family cell phone plan, cutting off both my parents and Terrence. I canceled all the premium streaming services they watched daily. Finally, I logged into my auto insurance portal and completely removed the policies I had been generously floating for Terrence and his wife Brittany. Every single safety net I provided was gone in less than 3 minutes. I put the iPad away and started the car engine. Almost immediately, my phone began to ring. It was a call from an unknown burner number. I answered it, connecting it to my car's Bluetooth system. "Jasmine, you absolute psycho!" a voice shrieked through the speakers. It was Brittany. She was absolutely livid, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. "I am stranded at my son's private school lacrosse game. I just got an email alert from the DMV that my SUV is uninsured and legally undrivable. How am I supposed to drive my kids home? How could you do this to us?" I merged into the downtown traffic, keeping my tone remarkably pleasant. "You can call a tow truck, Brittany," I suggested mildly. "Or better yet, you can use the $800 you spent on your blonde highlights last week to pay your own insurance premium. I am no longer funding your lifestyle." She gasped, sputtering with rage. "You are just a bitter, jealous spinster," she yelled, her true colors finally showing. "You are just mad that Terrence chose me and you have nobody." I laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Then I heard a scuffle on the other end of the line, and Terrence's voice came through the speaker. He had snatched the phone from his wife. "You are going to pay for this, Jasmine," he threatened, his voice shaking with anger. "I am coming down to your office right now, and I am going to put you in your place once and for all." I smiled, watching the city pass by through my windshield. "Come on down, Terrence," I replied cheerfully. "I will even validate your parking." I pressed the button on my steering wheel and disconnected the call. The silence in my car was absolute perfection. I navigated down the sweeping concrete ramp into the secure underground parking garage of my office building. My mind was already shifting from crisis creation to crisis management. I knew my family well, and Terrence was entirely predictable. He operated on a toxic mixture of blind rage and unearned entitlement. He would not wait to cool down. He would drive straight here, expecting my professional environment to shame me into submission. I parked my car in my reserved spot and grabbed my briefcase. Before stepping into the private elevator, I sent a quick text message to Marcus, the head of my building's private security detail. I told him I was expecting 2 hostile family members in the main lobby and that I wanted him flanking me the moment they stepped off the public elevators. I rode the elevator up to the penthouse suite that housed my firm. The lobby of my public relations agency was designed to project absolute calm and unshakable authority. White marble floors stretched across the expanse, meeting massive glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. My receptionist, Sarah, was typing quietly at her desk when I walked in. I told her to brace herself because a storm was about to hit the front doors. Less than 10 minutes later, The brass doors of the main public elevator slid open with a soft chime. Terrence and Brittany stormed out. Brittany was already in full performance mode. She had somehow managed to produce perfectly tragic tears on the short drive over. She rushed toward Sarah's desk, clutching her designer handbag, weeping loudly about how her cruel sister-in-law had left her stranded with her innocent children. It was a masterful display of weaponized tears, designed specifically to gain sympathy and paint me as the aggressive, angry woman attacking her fragile family. I stepped out from the glass doors of the inner office right as Marcus and another security guard stepped out from the side corridor. I stood perfectly still, watching Brittany's performance with mild, detached interest. Terrence charged forward, his face flushed with an ugly, dark red rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me across the marble floor. He screamed that I had lost my mind, that I was a bitter, vindictive woman who was trying to ruin his life because I could not find a man to tolerate mine. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked him how his luxury car financing went at the dealership. That question pushed him right over the edge. Terrence lost his temper entirely, and in his blind fury, he accidentally showed his entire hand. He screamed that he needed that car for his image and that he needed the house in his name immediately because he had promised Brittany a massive home equity line of credit. He yelled that Brittany was launching a luxury lifestyle brand and they needed $200,000 of equity from my parents' house to fund the initial inventory. The truth echoed off the marble walls. They were not just trying to steal my inheritance to secure a vague family legacy. They were actively planning to drain the entire equity of the property. They were going to leverage the house I had secretly paid for to fund Brittany's vanity project, effectively bankrupting our parents' estate in the process. I looked at Terrence with absolute disgust, realizing the depth of his parasitic greed. Before I could even respond, the public elevator chimed a second time. The heavy brass doors slid open again. My father Calvin stepped out into the lobby. He was breathing heavily, his face rigid with righteous anger. He marched straight past Brittany, who was still fake crying into a tissue. He marched past Marcus, who stepped slightly forward to block his path. Calvin waved a heavily stamped legal document in the air, brandishing it like a weapon. He announced to the entire lobby that he had driven straight from his lawyer's office. He declared that he had officially signed a comprehensive power of attorney over to Terrence. Calvin stood next to his golden son, projecting an aura of absolute patriarchal authority. He told me that he had taken legal steps to protect the family legacy from a greedy, ungrateful daughter who had lost her mind. Terrence smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, acting as if he now held the keys to the kingdom. He looked at me with a triumphant gleam in his eye, believing he had finally put me in my place. Calvin demanded that I immediately reinstate their auto insurance, pay the $3,500 mortgage, and apologize to Terrence and Brittany. He threatened that if I did not comply, Terrence would use his new power of attorney to legally bar me from the family properties and cut me out of their lives forever. I looked at my father. I looked at the legal document shaking in his hand. Then I looked at Terrence, who was grinning like he had just won the lottery. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that bounced off the glass walls of the lobby. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement. I asked my father if he really gave Terrence a power of attorney over his estate. I asked him if Terrence had bothered to tell him who actually held the deed to the house he was trying to borrow against. Calvin frowned, his authoritative posture faltering for a fraction of a second. He angrily stated that he owned his home and that his name was on the deed. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a sleek matte black business card. The card had no phone number and no email address. It simply had the name J Holdings LLC printed in silver foil. I stepped forward and handed the card directly to my father. He took it, looking down at the silver letters in confusion. I told him he should have Terrence run a full title search on the property before they started spending equity that did not exist. I told him to look very closely at the lien holder on his mortgage. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on them and walked toward the private elevator. I pressed the button and stepped inside. As the heavy doors began to slide shut, I looked through the narrowing gap. I saw my father holding the black business card. But more importantly, I saw Terence looking over our father's shoulder at the silver letters. I watched the color drain entirely from my brother's face as his eyes widened in absolute horror. He saw the letter J. He saw the LLC. In that brief, beautiful second before the elevator doors clicked shut, I watched Terence realize exactly what I had done and exactly who actually owned the roof over their heads. For 7 years, I quietly paid my parents' mortgage, keeping a roof over their heads, while my older brother played the golden child. I never asked for a thank you or any recognition, but when I accidentally saw their newly drafted will leaving every single family asset to him, I realized my only role in this family was being their personal ATM. So I completely closed my checkbook. A month later, my mother texted me, demanding her mortgage payment. I replied with 4 simple words that shattered our family forever. Ask the sole heir. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with a family member who took advantage of your success. My name is Jasmine. I am 35 years old, and I run one of the top crisis public relations firms in downtown Atlanta. My daily life is spent putting out massive corporate fires, managing scandals, and controlling disastrous narratives for high-profile clients. I know exactly how to stay calm under intense pressure because growing up in my family, I had no choice but to learn how to keep my composure. My parents, Brenda and Calvin, always made sure I knew my place. I was the reliable one, the workhorse, the daughter who was expected to quietly succeed and cheerfully fund the family, while all their emotional and financial energy went to my older brother, Terence. Terence was the undisputed golden child. While I built my business from the ground up through grueling 80-hour work weeks, Terence was a serial entrepreneur whose ventures always miraculously failed just when he needed our parents to bail him out. Whether it was a luxury sneaker line that never saw production or a cryptocurrency startup that folded in 3 months, Terence always walked away without a scratch. He was charismatic, loud, and entirely convinced of his own superiority. It was a trait heavily encouraged by my parents and fully supported by his highly entitled wife, Brittany. It was a Tuesday morning. The Atlanta skyline was bright and clear outside my floor-to-ceiling office windows. I was sipping my coffee and reviewing a complex mitigation strategy for a corporate client when my personal cell phone buzzed on the glass desk. The screen lit up with a message from my mother, Brenda. There was no hello. There was no asking how my day was. There was just a cold, hard demand. The mortgage is due. Where's the transfer? $3,500. That was the exact amount I had been quietly wiring to her account on the first of every month for the past 7 years. But after what I had discovered at their house during Sunday dinner, the week before, everything had changed. I had walked into my father's home office to grab a pen and saw their estate planning documents lying wide open on his mahogany desk. The paperwork was perfectly clear and fully signed. The house, which was only out of foreclosure because of my monthly payments, was going 100% to Terence to secure his family legacy. Every bank account, every piece of jewelry, and the deed to the property were all designated for my brother. My name was not even mentioned as an alternate. I picked up my phone. I did not type out a long emotional explanation about how used and discarded I felt. I did not ask for an apology. I simply typed 4 words and hit send. Ask the sole heir. The reaction was instantaneous. Within 10 seconds, my phone began vibrating continuously across my desk. First, it was my mother calling twice in a row. Then my father, Calvin, called. I watched their names flash on the screen, feeling a strange new sense of liberation as I let every single call roll to voicemail. I picked up my pen and went back to my client file, refusing to let their panic disrupt my morning. 5 minutes later, a different ringtone cut through the quiet of my office. It was Terence. I decided to answer. I pressed the speaker button and leaned back in my leather chair. Jasmine, what is wrong with you? Terence barked immediately, not bothering with a greeting. Mom is in hysterics. What kind of disrespectful game are you playing with their mortgage? I am not playing anything, Terrence. I replied, my voice perfectly level. I am simply stepping back. Since Dad felt it was completely appropriate to leave the entire family estate to you to secure your legacy, I figured you should be the one carrying the financial burden of that estate. You are being a bitter, jealous spinster, he spat back, his voice echoing in my spacious office. You think because you have this little PR hobby that you can disrespect this family. You owe Mom and Dad. You owe this family respect. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip before responding. Respect does not pay a $3,500 mortgage, Terrence, but I am sure your legacy will cover it. I reached over and tapped the button to end the call, cutting off whatever insult he was preparing to hurl next. I exhaled, feeling the residual adrenaline fading. I thought that would be the end of it for the day. I had a critical lunch meeting scheduled in 20 minutes with a prospective client at the upscale French bistro, located on the ground floor of my office building. This was a multi-million-dollar account, and I needed complete focus. I gathered my files and my designer handbag, preparing to shift my energy entirely back to my career. Just as I stood up, the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was my executive assistant, her voice tight with a mixture of professional restraint and underlying alarm. Jasmine, I am so sorry to interrupt, she said quickly, but your parents just barged past the lobby security downstairs. They are demanding to see you, and they are marching directly into the bistro where your client is waiting. I watched the glowing numbers above the elevator doors count down as I descended to the ground floor. My pulse remained perfectly steady. Marcus, the head of our building security, stood quietly beside me with his hands clasped behind his back. I had briefed him on the situation. I told him we had 2 hostile trespassers and that he was to treat them exactly as he would treat any violent corporate threat. When the polished steel doors slid open, the sound of high-pitched theatrical sobbing echoed across the expansive white marble lobby. Brittany was leaning heavily against the sleek glass reception desk, giving an absolute masterclass in weaponized vulnerability. She was utilizing her white tears to maximum effect. Her blonde hair was artfully disheveled, and genuine wet tears were streaming down her flushed cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She was practically wailing to my receptionist Sarah about how she had been aggressively victimized. She cried out loudly, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear about how she was a devoted mother of 3 young boys who had just been terrified and stranded on the side of the road. She claimed her unhinged sister-in-law had maliciously canceled her car insurance out of pure vindictive spite, leaving her children in grave danger. She played the fragile, terrified suburban mother, perfectly hoping to turn my own staff against me and paint me as the angry, aggressive black woman attacking her innocent family. Sarah remained completely neutral, her hands folded politely on her desk, but I could see the distinct professional discomfort in her eyes. I stepped out of the elevator. My designer heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, ringing out like a steady metronome. Sarah looked utterly relieved to see me. Brittany stopped her sobbing instantly, her head snapping toward my direction. The fragile victim act vanished in a split second, replacing itself with a glare of pure venom. Before she could even open her mouth to speak, Terrence lunged forward. Terrence was sweating through his designer shirt. It was wrinkled, and his face was a tight mask of furious entitlement. He tried to march directly into my personal space to intimidate me, but Marcus immediately stepped between us, blocking his path with his massive frame. Terrence was forced to halt, but the blind rage poured out of him. He demanded that I restore his phone service right this second. He ordered me to reinstate the auto insurance and apologize to his wife for traumatizing his children. He yelled that my public relations firm was a joke and that I had no right to play God with his life just because I managed to scrape together some corporate money. I let him exhaust his lungs. I stood there in my custom-tailored emerald suit, looking at my older brother with absolute clinical detachment. I told him he was standing in a professional corporate building, acting like a spoiled teenager whose allowance had just been cut off. I reminded him that I owed him absolutely nothing. I had carried his financial dead weight for a decade. I told him that the moment I discovered he and my parents were conspiring behind my back to steal the very house I had been saving, he lost the right to demand anything from me ever again. That is when Terrence lost whatever tiny shred of self-control he had left in his system. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that the house was his absolute birthright. He shouted that he needed the deed transferred into his name immediately. Not next year. Not when our parents eventually passed away. He needed it right now. He yelled that he had a strict timeline to keep and that my temper tantrum was ruining his business schedule. He screamed that he had promised Brittany a massive home equity line of credit and they needed the house to secure the loan from the bank. He shouted that Brittany was launching a luxury wellness and lifestyle brand and they needed $200,000 in startup capital by the end of the month to secure her inventory and warehouse space. The entire lobby went dead silent. Even Brittany froze, her eyes widening in sheer panic as she realized what her husband had just confessed in front of a room full of people. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back, trying to silence him, but the damage was already done. The pieces rapidly clicked together in my mind, forming a picture so greedy and so reckless it almost took my breath away. They were not just securing a legacy for the distant future. They were actively planning to bleed the estate dry right now. They were going to use my parents' fully paid-off home as collateral to fund Brittany's absolute vanity project. A wellness brand that would inevitably fail just like every single one of Terrence's brilliant business ideas. They were planning to drain $200,000 of equity out of the property, default on the loan payments, and let the bank foreclose on the house. They were going to leave our elderly parents entirely homeless and utterly bankrupt just so Brittany could sell overpriced yoga mats and organic candles on the internet. I looked at Brittany, who was now pale and shrinking behind her husband, avoiding my gaze entirely. I looked at Terrence, who was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, still entirely convinced he was in the right. I slowly shook my head. I told them they were both absolute fools. I told Terrence he was planning to destroy his own parents' lives out of pure selfish greed. I told him I would rather burn my wealth in the street than watch him drain my parents dry to fund his delusions of grandeur. Terrence roared, stepping forward to push past the security guard. He screamed that I had no power here and that our father had already fixed everything to put me in my place once and for all. Before Marcus could physically remove him from the building, the soft chime of the elevator echoed through the tense lobby. The heavy metal doors slid open. Calvin stepped out. My father was breathing hard, his chest puffing out, his face red with a familiar, terrifying rage. He walked straight past Brittany and Terrence. He looked directly at me, and in his clenched fist, he was waving a heavily stamped legal document in the air. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the white marble walls of the lobby. It was not a bitter sound or a defensive reaction. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement. You gave Terrence power of attorney. That is absolutely fascinating, Dad. Did Terrence tell you who actually holds the deed to your house? Calvin froze. The heavy legal document he was waving in the air slowly lowered to his side. He stared at me, his forehead wrinkling in deep confusion. The flush of righteous anger on his face was immediately replaced by a look of profound uncertainty. He puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his patriarchal authority in front of my staff and the building's security. I do not know what kind of corporate trick you think you are pulling, Jasmine, he demanded, his voice booming through the quiet expanse of the room. I own my house. My name is on that deed. I bought that property 30 years ago. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting the exact same unshakable authority I used when dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. You almost lost that house 7 years ago, Dad. I reminded him, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm. Do you remember the bright yellow foreclosure notice taped to your front door? Do you remember calling me in tears, begging me to make it go away because Terrence had drained your entire retirement savings for his failed tech startup? I watched my father's jaw clench. He hated being reminded of his financial failures, especially the ones caused directly by his golden boy. He had handed me a stack of final warnings from the bank and simply expected me to fix it. And I did fix it. But I did not give them a handout. I formed a private holding company called J Holdings LLC. I bought the distressed debt directly from the bank, paid off the massive arrears, and assumed full legal ownership of the property. The mountain of paperwork you signed in my lawyer's office 7 years ago was not a magical loan restructuring, I explained, watching the devastating truth finally land. It was a transfer of deed. You signed away your ownership to save yourselves from bankruptcy and homelessness. I became the landlord. You became my tenants. And your monthly mortgage payment was simply your rent. Terrence yanked his phone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device on the marble floor. He frantically accessed the county's public property tax database, his thumbs flying across the glass screen. I stood there adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer, waiting patiently for the digital confirmation of his absolute ruin. Marcus, my security chief, stood silently beside me, watching the entire breakdown with professional detachment. Dad, Terrence whispered, his voice completely stripped of its former arrogance. He stared at his phone screen, his eyes wide with horror. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. The owner on file is J Holdings, LLC. It has been registered to that company since 2019. Calvin snatched the phone out of his son's hands. He pulled his reading glasses from his shirt pocket and scanned the tiny, glowing screen. I watched the reality of his situation crash into him like a freight train. The illusion of his control shattered into a million pieces right there in my lobby. He did not own his castle. He had not owned it for nearly a decade. He was a renter living entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had just tried to disown and replace. Brittany, who had been standing completely frozen, suddenly came alive. The brutal math clicked in her head. No deed meant no home equity. No equity meant no $200,000 loan from the bank. No loan meant her luxury lifestyle brand was dead before she could even print the business cards. The carefully constructed facade of her wealthy suburban life evaporated in an instant. She turned on Terrence like a cornered wild animal. "You told me we had the money!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the reception area. "You said your father was signing the house over to us today. You promised me that funding, Terrence. I already signed the commercial lease for the warehouse. I already authorized the inventory orders." Terrence tried to shush her, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of masculine control in a room full of strangers. "Brittany, lower your voice," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "We will figure this out. I have power of attorney now. We will find another way to get the capital." "There is no other way," Brittany screamed, pulling her arm out of his grasp. "If we do not secure that loan by Friday, we are going to be sued for breach of contract. We will be bankrupt, Terrence." I looked directly at my father. He was staring blankly at the floor, the heavy stamped document hanging loosely from his fingertips. "You came into my place of business to threaten me, Dad," I said smoothly, bringing his attention back to me. "You wanted to hand Terrence the keys to your life because you thought I was just a bitter spinster who existed to fund your mistakes. Congratulations, you got exactly what you wanted. Terrence is now completely legally responsible for your financial well-being." I turned to Marcus and extended my hand. He reached behind the reception desk and handed me a thick manila envelope. I had prepared it the moment I severed their family accounts from my iPad earlier that morning. I walked forward, stopping just a few feet away from my brother. I held the envelope out to him. "Since you are officially acting as Dad's legal and financial representative, I am serving this directly to you," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "It is a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises." Calvin gasped, his hand flying to his chest. "You are evicting your own parents. You are throwing us out on the street." "I am reclaiming my commercial property," I replied, showing absolutely zero emotion. "You made it perfectly clear today that you consider me nothing more than a utility, a bank to fund Terrence's lifestyle. I am permanently closing the bank and liquidating the assets." Terrence dropped the power of attorney document on the floor. He stepped toward me, his hands raised in a pathetic, pleading gesture. The smug entitlement was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating desperation. "Jasmine, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Come on, be reasonable. You know Brittany signed those contracts. If you kick them out and we do not get that equity loan, my family is completely ruined. You cannot do this to us." "That sounds like a massive public relations crisis," I replied, offering him a cold corporate smile. Unfortunately, you cannot afford my hourly rate to manage it. Before Terence could fall to his knees and beg, the public elevator chimed once more. The heavy brass doors slid open, and two uniformed Atlanta police officers stepped out into the lobby. They scanned the room, their eyes immediately locking onto my brother. Terence Calvin Wilson, the lead officer, asked, stepping forward with his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. We received an automated fraud alert from a high-level wealth management firm this morning. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding felony identity theft and wire fraud at the Lexus dealership across town. Put your hands behind your back. My father stopped exactly 2 feet away from me. Marcus immediately shifted his weight, his hand dropping casually to his radio, prepared to intervene the second this man crossed a physical line. I gave Marcus a subtle 2-finger gesture to stand down. I wanted to let Calvin speak. I wanted to give him enough rope to completely hang himself. Calvin stood in the center of my sleek modern office lobby, looking entirely out of place. He was a man who relied on outdated intimidation tactics, a man used to ruling his suburban household with an iron fist and a booming voice. He expected the world to shrink when he entered a room. He shoved the thick, notarized packet toward my face, the heavy paper rustling loudly in the quiet corporate space. "Do you know what this is, Jasmine?" he demanded. He did not bother lowering his voice. In fact, he projected it clearly, attempting to create a spectacle. He wanted to shame me in front of Sarah, the receptionist, the security team, and the few junior associates who had paused near the glass conference rooms. He wanted me to feel like a disobedient child being scolded in public. I did not answer. I simply stared at the document, maintaining the absolute stillness I utilized during hostile negotiations. "I just left the attorney's office," Calvin announced, puffing out his chest. "I have taken the necessary steps to secure this family. I have officially signed a comprehensive, durable power of attorney over to Terence. I have given him total, unquestioned legal control over my finances, my healthcare, and my estate." The words echoed off the white marble floors. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and triumphant finality. I had to take immediate action to protect the family legacy from a greedy, ungrateful daughter who has clearly lost her mind. The transformation in my brother was instantaneous and sickening to watch. The red-faced, sweating, panicked man who had been screaming about his ruined business timeline just seconds ago vanished completely. With his father standing beside him, acting as his absolute shield, Terence morphed back into the untouchable golden child. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture widening to mirror our father's aggressive stance. A slow, deeply arrogant smirk spread across his face. He looked at me as if he now held the absolute keys to the kingdom, as if this stack of stamped paper made him the undisputed master of my reality. Brittany, sensing the shift in power, stepped out from behind her husband. Her theatrical tears dried up instantly. She smoothed down her designer blouse and lifted her chin, staring at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She leaned in close to Terence, whispering something in his ear about how they were going to get their bank funding today. She was already spending the money in her head, completely convinced that Calvin had just handed them a blank check to fund her ridiculous luxury lifestyle brand. "Your little rebellion ends right here," Calvin dictated, pointing a thick finger at the marble floor beneath my designer heels. "You have forgotten where you come from and who raised you. I am giving you one chance to fix this before the damage is permanent." He listed his demands like a general dictating terms of surrender. He ordered me to walk back into my penthouse office, log into my master accounts, and immediately reinstate the auto insurance policies for Terence and Brittany. He demanded that the $3,500 mortgage payment be wired into his checking account before the end of the business day. Finally, he demanded that I look his son and his daughter-in-law in the eye and offer a full, sincere apology for the stress and trauma I had inflicted upon their innocent family. "And if I decline your generous offer, Dad?" I asked, my voice remaining quiet, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. Calvin's face flushed a deeper, more dangerous shade of crimson. "If you refuse me," he warned, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register, "Terence will use this document today. He will use his legal authority to permanently bar you from the family properties. You will not be allowed to set foot in my home. You will be completely disinherited, stripped of your name, and erased from this family. You will get absolutely nothing. The sheer staggering irony of his threat washed over me. It was so profound it almost felt heavy. I stood there looking at the man who had demanded my financial submission for a decade. He was threatening to exile me from a kingdom I had secretly purchased just to keep him from living on the street. He was dangling an inheritance over my head that consisted of absolutely nothing but toxic debt and a piece of real estate that I legally owned. I looked at the power of attorney document trembling in his fist. It was a real legally binding contract. My father had actually driven to a law firm and paid a retainer to hand the steering wheel of a sinking, burning ship directly over to the iceberg that caused the crash. I shifted my gaze to Terrence. He gave me a single slow, smug nod. He really believed he had won. He believed he could take that piece of paper into a bank tomorrow morning, leverage my parents' house, take out a $200,000 home equity line of credit, and leave me completely out in the cold while he funded his wife's vanity project. He thought he had outsmarted me. The tension in the lobby reached a breaking point. Sarah was holding her breath behind the reception desk. Marcus shifted his weight, anticipating a physical altercation. Calvin stood rigid, waiting for me to break down, apologize, and open my checkbook just like I had always done in the past. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizingly long seconds, allowing them to fully bask in their false victory. Then I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was not a bitter sound or a defensive reaction. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement that echoed brightly against the glass walls. You gave Terrence power of attorney. That is fascinating, Dad. Did Terrence tell you who actually holds the deed to your house? The elevator ascended smoothly, leaving the chaos of the lobby far below. I smoothed the lapels of my emerald blazer, my pulse beating at a perfectly steady, unbothered rhythm. The image of Terrence staring at that matte black business card was permanently burned into my memory. His arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had just declared war on the actual owner of the battlefield. I stepped out of the elevator and walked directly into my penthouse suite. The space was a sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass-polished steel and quiet efficiency. My wealth manager David was already waiting at my custom walnut desk. He stood up as I entered, a thick leather portfolio resting in front of him. David had been with me for a decade. He knew every financial skeleton buried in my family's closet because he had helped me dig the graves. They took the bait, I said, taking my seat and gesturing for him to sit. David offered a sharp, approving smile. I monitored the lobby cameras. Your brother looked like he swallowed a stone. He is about to swallow a boulder, I replied, leaning back in my chair. Show me the current ledger. David opened the portfolio and slid a heavily annotated financial statement across the desk. As expected, the first of the month came and went. The automatic transfer from your father's account to J Holdings LLC was returned for insufficient funds. He officially missed his payment. By redirecting his liquid cash to fund Terrence's sudden demands, your father has triggered the default clause. I looked down at the highlighted red numbers on the spreadsheet. A profound sense of vindication washed over me. This exact scenario had been 7 years in the making. He actually thinks he missed a mortgage payment to a bank, I said, tracing the edge of the paper with my manicured fingernail. He thinks he has a 30-day grace period before anyone even notices. He is operating under the delusion that he still owns the asset, David noted, tapping a secondary document. Which brings us back to the original acquisition. We did not need to review the history, but looking at the original paperwork always centered me. 7 years ago, Calvin and Brenda had driven their finances off a sheer cliff. Terrence had convinced them to invest their entire retirement savings into a spectacular failure of a technology startup. When the startup inevitably collapsed, my parents were left holding a mountain of debt. They had secretly taken out a second mortgage, maxed out their credit cards, and drained every drop of equity from the home they had lived in for 30 years. They were exactly 30 days away from total foreclosure. The bank had already filed the paperwork. The auction date was set. Calvin had called me into his study one evening, refusing to look me in the eye. He handed me the bright yellow foreclosure notice and simply expected me to write a check to make his embarrassment disappear. He did not apologize. He did not take accountability. He simply commanded me to fix the mess his golden boy had created, insisting that family protects family. He demanded I pay off the bank and allow him to maintain his pride and his credit score. I refused to be his disposable ATM. Instead, I gave him a solution wrapped in an invisible cage. I still remember the look on his face when you presented the restructuring plan, David said, pulling up the digital archives from that day. He signed a stack of documents without reading a single paragraph. He was too eager to hide his failure to realize he was signing over the deed. I did not just pay his mortgage, I corrected quietly. I bought the distressed note entirely. I swooped in through J Holdings, LLC, purchased the debt directly from the bank at a premium, and assumed absolute legal ownership of the property. I saved him from bankruptcy. I saved his precious social standing, but I stripped him of his most valuable asset. For 7 years, I had acted as their private zero-interest bank. I kept the roof over their heads while letting them play rich in front of their suburban friends. The monthly payment Calvin proudly made, the payment he loudly bragged about never missing, was not a mortgage. It was rent. He was funneling money directly into my LLC, completely oblivious to the fact that his ungrateful daughter was his landlord. And because they missed this month's payment, David stated, pointing to the default clause highlighted in bright yellow, they are in breach of the lease agreement. The grace period for a standard mortgage does not apply here. As a commercial tenant under J Holdings, missing a payment by 5 days grants the holding company the immediate right to initiate eviction proceedings or liquidate the property. Liquidate. I echoed, testing the word. It tasted like absolute victory. They tried to use my money to fund a vanity project for Brittany's wellness brand. They tried to leverage a house they do not even own to secure a $200,000 home equity line of credit. They thought they could bleed me dry and cast me aside. Now they have handed me the legal authority to sell the property out from under them. David nodded, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he prepared the necessary legal filings. I have the eviction notices drafted. I also have a list of commercial buyers who have been eyeing that specific neighborhood for redevelopment. We can have the property listed and sold within 14 days. They will have nothing. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city. I had spent my entire life being pushed aside, minimized, and treated as an endless resource to be exploited. My mother had constantly reminded me that I was a disappointment because I chose boardrooms over baby showers. My father had used my success to clean up his son's endless stream of catastrophic failures. They had demanded everything from me while respecting absolutely nothing about me. Now the trap was perfectly sprung. The dominoes were lined up exactly where I had placed them. All I had to do was push. File the default notice I commanded without turning around. Initiate the liquidation protocol. Let us see how much Terrence can accomplish when he is managing a bankrupt estate with zero collateral. Before David could hit the send key, his encrypted tablet emitted a sharp, high-pitched ping. It was the distinct sound of a priority financial alert. David picked up the device, his eyes scanning the incoming data feed. The satisfied expression on his face hardened into a look of sharp, urgent focus. He stood up from the desk and walked over to where I was standing. Without saying a word, he slid the tablet across the polished glass table toward me. Terrence is at the county clerk's office right now, David said, his voice tight. He is trying to push the HELOC through using the power of attorney. I looked down at the sleek digital tablet resting on the polished surface of my custom walnut desk. The screen glowed brightly in the muted lighting of my penthouse office. David had already synced the live video feed. My head of corporate security, Marcus, maintained deep interlocking ties with municipal law enforcement and city building directors across the greater metropolitan area. A single encrypted text message from Marcus had yielded a direct real-time feed from the high-definition surveillance cameras inside the downtown county clerk and municipal lending division. The audio was surprisingly crisp, picking up the ambient hum of the busy government building and the specific voices near the designated loan processing counters. There was my older brother Terrence pacing back and forth in front of desk number 4. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that looked slightly wrinkled across the shoulders. He was sweating heavily despite the aggressive air conditioning of the municipal building. Brittany stood right beside him, clinging to his arm. She was dressed in a pristine white designer dress, clutching a luxury leather handbag like a royal scepter. She was projecting the exact haughty, impatient energy of a wealthy CEO, waiting for a minor administrative error to be corrected. She was already mentally spending the $200,000 she believed was completely guaranteed. Terrence slapped a thick stack of papers flat against the laminate counter of the loan officer's desk. The microphone picked up the sharp smack of the paper hitting the wood. He pointed aggressively at the top sheet, which bore the heavy gold notary seal of Dad's newly signed power of attorney. "I do not have time to sit here and wait for your standard processing windows." Terrence dictated, his voice dripping with unearned authority and supreme arrogance. "I am the legally appointed financial representative for the Calvin Wilson estate. I am submitting the application for a $200,000 home equity line of credit against the primary residence. The house has been fully paid off for years. The equity is sitting right there. I need this paperwork expedited and the capital cleared for transfer into my corporate accounts by tomorrow morning." The loan officer sitting across the desk was a mild-mannered older man with thinning gray hair and thick wire-rimmed glasses. He remained completely unbothered by Terrence's aggressive posturing. He had likely dealt with hundreds of entitled, arrogant men demanding money they had not earned. He calmly picked up the power of attorney document, adjusted his glasses, and began typing Calvin's social security number and the property address into the county property and title database. I leaned forward in my leather chair, resting my chin on my intertwined fingers. I watched the screen with absolute clinical detachment, waiting for the precise moment reality crashed into my brother's magnificent delusions. The loan officer stopped typing. He pushed his glasses further up his nose and leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the digital property records. A distinct frown creased his forehead. He clicked his mouse twice, opening a secondary window to verify the specific details of the deed. Then he looked up at Terrence. It was not a look of intimidation or respect, or even customer service politeness. It was a look of profound, absolute pity. "I cannot process a home equity line of credit for this address, sir," the loan officer stated, his voice calm and carrying clearly through the audio feed. Terrence scoffed, throwing his hands up in the air in a dramatic display of frustration. "Are you incapable of reading a simple legal document? I just handed you a durable power of attorney. I have total legal control over my father's assets. Run the address again. Your system is obviously lagging." "The system is perfectly accurate," the clerk replied, his tone dropping into that specific, gentle register reserved for delivering financially devastating news. "Your father, Calvin Wilson, does not own this property. He is not listed on the deed. He has not owned this property for exactly 7 years." Brittany let out a sharp, confused gasp. Terrence slammed both hands flat on the desk, leaning his weight forward over the counter. "What are you talking about? My parents have lived in that house for 30 years. There is no mortgage. It is free and clear. The property underwent a distress deed transfer in lieu of foreclosure 7 years ago," the clerk explained, turning his computer monitor around so Terrence and Brittany could see the glowing digital record. "The deed was transferred entirely to a private holding company. The property is currently owned 100% by an entity registered as J Holdings, LLC. Furthermore, there is a massive corporate lien placed on the property by that same LLC. Your father holds absolutely zero equity in this address. You cannot borrow a single dime against this property because it does not belong to your family." I watched the exact second the truth detonated inside Terrence's brain. His eyes locked onto the name on the screen. J Holdings, LLC. The J stood for Jasmine. The color drained completely and instantaneously from his face, leaving his skin looking pale and sickly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the municipal building. He stumbled backward half a step, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He realized that the home he considered his royal birthright, the asset he planned to bleed dry to fund his wife's vanity project, belonged entirely to the sister he had just tried to discard. Brittany's knees physically buckled. She had to grab the edge of the loan officer's desk to keep from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. Her carefully constructed facade of wealthy suburban perfection evaporated in an instant. She turned to Terrence, her eyes wide with mounting absolute terror. She had already signed a binding commercial lease for her wellness brand warehouse. She had authorized massive expensive inventory orders for organic candles and branded yoga mats. She had tied her personal credit to strict vendor contracts based entirely on Terrence's promise of a $200,000 bank injection. She was suddenly staring directly down the barrel of a massive catastrophic personal bankruptcy. Terrence lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left in his system. The realization that he had absolutely no leverage, no capital, and no golden parachute completely broke his mind. He let out a primal, furious roar. He swept his arm violently across the desk, sending a heavy plastic brochure holder, a cup of pens, and a stack of blank application forms crashing onto the floor. "This is a setup!" He screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed wildly through the quiet municipal building. "That is a fraudulent shell company. My sister is trying to steal my family legacy. I demand to see the branch manager. I want the bank president out here right now. You are all conspiring to ruin me." He was throwing a full-blown violent toddler tantrum in the middle of a crowded government office. People in the waiting area immediately stood up, pulling their cell phones out of their pockets to record the man in the custom suit completely losing his mind. Brittany was pulling desperately at the sleeve of his jacket, sobbing and begging him to stop making a scene, but he shoved her away blindly. Two large municipal security guards in dark uniforms quickly approached desk number 4. They did not bother asking Terrence to lower his voice or calm down. They grabbed him firmly by both arms, twisting them securely behind his back, and forcefully marched him away from the counter. Terrence thrashed and kicked his expensive leather shoes, sliding awkwardly on the polished floor as they dragged him toward the sliding glass exit doors. He was shouting incoherent threats about lawsuits and birthrights. Brittany scrambled after them, covering her face with her luxury handbag, trying desperately to hide from the dozen cell phone cameras recording her absolute public humiliation. David reached across my desk and tapped the tablet, ending the video feed. The screen faded to black, leaving my penthouse office in total serene silence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a cold, settling satisfaction spread through my chest. The checkmate was silent and total. Calvin had handed Terrence a loaded gun, and Terrence had immediately shot himself in the foot in front of the entire county. The safety net was permanently gone. They were finally experiencing the real-world consequences of their own reckless, entitled financial choices. I was just about to instruct David to finalize and file the 30-day eviction notice when the quiet atmosphere of my office was shattered. My personal cell phone began vibrating aggressively against the walnut wood of my desk, emitting a shrill, panicked ringtone. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen on my personal line in nearly 8 months. It was Brenda, my mother. I picked up the phone, swiped the screen to answer, and brought the device to my ear. Before I could even say a single word, a sound of absolute hysterical, breathless crying blasted through the speaker. The sound of Brenda's crying blasted through the speaker of my phone. It was a high-pitched, vibrating wail that forced me to pull the device an entire inch away from my ear just to protect my hearing. It was the exact same theatrical, manufactured sobbing Brittany had utilized down in the lobby, proving exactly where my sister-in-law had learned the technique. I stood perfectly still by the floor-to-ceiling window of my penthouse office, watching the tiny cars move along the Atlanta streets far below. I let her cry. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not ask her what was wrong or try to soothe her manufactured panic. I simply allowed the dead air on my end of the line to stretch out, forcing her to realize she was performing for an entirely captive but completely unsympathetic audience. When she realized that her wordless wailing was not going to elicit the frantic, dutiful response she was accustomed to receiving from her daughter, Brenda shifted her tactics. The hysterical crying morphed into a rhythmic, almost practiced lamentation. She launched into a masterclass of weaponized maternal guilt, A monologue she had likely been rehearsing the entire car ride home from the municipal building. "Jasmine, how could you do this to us?" she gasped, her voice trembling with absolute dramatic flair. "How could you humiliate your own flesh and blood in a public building? I labored for 2 days to bring you into this world. I sacrificed my youth, my body, and my dreams, so you could have a roof over your head and food on your plate. I scrubbed floors and worked my fingers to the bone to raise you. I listened to this desperate attempt to rewrite history with absolute clinical detachment. My mother was painting a picture of selfless, maternal martyrdom, completely glossing over the fact that she had spent my entire childhood treating me like an inconvenient shadow. She had never scrubbed a floor to provide for me. She had, however, scrubbed Dad's credit clean multiple times to buy Terrence a brand new car every time he wrecked one. When the guilt trip failed to generate a response, she brought God into the negotiation. It always came to this when my parents needed to justify their toxic, parasitic behavior. She elevated her voice into a trembling, righteous cadence, sounding exactly like a Sunday morning televangelist demanding a financial offering. "The Bible says, 'Honor thy father and thy mother,'" Jasmine, she preached, her tone sharp and accusatory. "It is a commandment from the Lord himself. He commands you to respect the people who gave you life. You are inviting a terrible curse upon your own head by treating your family with such cold, bitter disrespect. The Lord sees your hardened heart. He sees how you are treating the people who raised you." She wielded religion not as a source of comfort or moral guidance, but as a heavy, blunt instrument designed to batter me into financial submission. She genuinely believed that divine law required me to quietly absorb their abuse, surrender my assets, and fund their endless stream of delusions. The holy sermon seamlessly transitioned into a vicious, desperate attack. "You are being so vindictive." Brenda spat, her tone shifting from a wounded mother to a cornered, aggressive animal. "You are deliberately trying to destroy your brother out of pure ugly spite. Terrence is a good man trying to build a legacy for his beautiful family. He just needs a little bit of help to get on his feet. He needs his blessing, Jasmine, and you are selfishly standing in the way of his blessing." She was actually framing Terrence's attempt to fraudulently leverage a property he did not own as a divine right. "I am your mother, and I am telling you to drop this ridiculous charade right now," Brenda demanded, her voice cracking with sheer entitlement. "Call that loan officer back. Release that corporate lien today so Terrence can get his equity loan. You have more than enough money sitting in your bank accounts. You do not need that house. Give your brother his blessing." I stood in the serene silence of my office. David remained seated at my walnut desk, watching me with quiet, professional respect. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not try to argue the legal logistics or defend my actions to a woman who lived in a completely fabricated reality. There was absolutely no point in trying to reason with someone whose only goal was to extract my resources. Instead, I let her finish her frantic, demanding rant. I waited until she paused to take a ragged, heavy breath. "Do you remember the kitchen table in the old house, Mom?" I asked, my voice carrying the smooth, dangerous calm of a velvet wire. I heard a slight hesitation on the other end of the line. The sudden quiet shift in my tone caught her completely off guard. I did not wait for her to answer. "I was 18 years old." I continued, my words clipping through the air with surgical precision. "I had just received my acceptance letter to the university. I had secured a partial academic scholarship through my own hard work, but I was short. I needed a co-signer for a tiny, insignificant student loan to cover my freshman dorm and my textbooks. It was a fraction of the money you had just spent sending Terrence on a celebratory graduation trip to Europe. I just needed a signature on a piece of paper." Brenda started to stammer, a sudden panic infecting her voice as the trap rapidly snapped shut around her ankles. "Jasmine, that was a very long time ago. We were struggling financially back then. You have to understand." "You looked me dead in the eye," I said, slicing straight through her pathetic revisionist excuse. "I sat at that table and I begged you. I showed you my straight A report card. I showed you my meticulously researched business plan. And you looked at your ambitious, hardworking teenage daughter, and you gave me your final answer." I let the silence hang for exactly 2 seconds, ensuring she felt the full weight of the memory. You said I am not tying my good credit to a girl who is just going to fail anyway. You are a wasted investment. Go get a job at the mall. Brenda let out a loud, theatrical gasp. She immediately tried to launch into another round of aggressive, hyperventilating sobs, desperate to play the victim. Jasmine, you cannot hold on to the past like this. You have to forgive your family. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the bright red icon on the glass screen. The call disconnected instantly, severing her wailing right in the middle of a pathetic, manipulative sob. I tossed the cell phone onto the polished surface of my walnut desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. David raised a single eyebrow but remained perfectly silent. The atmosphere in the office was beautiful, quiet, and entirely under my control. I stood there adjusting the cuffs of my emerald blazer, letting the absolute finality of the moment wash over me. I had finally closed the door on decades of emotional extortion. Then the screen of my phone lit up, vibrating aggressively against the dark wood. It was a text message. It was not from Brenda. It was from Terrence. I leaned over the desk and read the preview banner glowing on the locked screen. The words were a desperate, vicious ultimatum. The panoramic view from my 42nd floor office offered a sweeping, uninterrupted gaze over the city's financial district, but my attention was entirely captivated by a single illuminated line of red text on the encrypted tablet resting before me. The quiet hum of the climate control was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation that red line represented. Sitting across my custom obsidian glass desk was Arthur, my lead wealth manager and the chief architect of my private portfolios. He had been with me for the better part of a decade, and he knew the intricate dark tapestry of my family's history just as well as I did. He took a slow sip of his espresso, his expression one of clinical professional satisfaction. The grace period expired at midnight. Arthur stated, his voice a low, steady baritone that cut through the silence of the office. The automatic withdrawal from Calvin and Brenda's primary checking account was returned for insufficient funds. The secondary attempt, 48 hours later, yielded the exact same result. They have officially missed their monthly payment. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, letting the words wash over me like a long-awaited exhale. A cold, magnificent sense of vindication settled deep in my chest. They actually did it, I murmured, tracing the rim of my own coffee cup. They drained their liquidity to fund Terrence's latest delusion, and they sacrificed their primary obligation to do it. It is a textbook default, Arthur confirmed, sliding a heavy leather-bound legal dossier across the smooth glass. And it triggers every single acceleration clause we meticulously built into the contract. I rested my hand on the leather cover of the dossier. Inside this folder lay the absolute, indisputable proof of my parents' financial incompetence and the secret I had guarded with ruthless precision for 7 years. To the outside world, to their country club friends, their church congregation, and their relentlessly favored golden child son, Terrence Calvin and Brenda, were the picture of affluent, unbothered suburban grace. They threw lavish dinner parties, drove leased luxury sedans, and turned their noses up at anyone who didn't meet their exhausting superficial standards. They looked down on me, their daughter, treating my quiet, relentless climb up the corporate ladder as some sort of unseemly, unfeminine rebellion. But 7 years ago, that pristine facade had been 30 days away from complete and total annihilation. My parents had always lived terrifyingly beyond their means, funding their arrogance with a fragile house of cards built on high-interest credit and terrible investments. When that house of cards inevitably collapsed under the weight of one of Terrence's catastrophic failed business ventures, they were left drowning. They had secretly taken out a second mortgage, drained their retirement accounts, and missed so many payments that the bank had finally lost patience. I vividly remember the evening Calvin called me into his study. He didn't look at me with the humility of a man facing ruin. He looked at me with the impatient expectation of a king demanding tribute from a lesser subject. He had tossed the bright yellow notice of foreclosure onto his desk, informing me that it was my duty as his daughter to liquidate my own burgeoning investment portfolio to fix the bank's clerical error. There was no apology. There was no accountability. There was only the toxic, suffocating demand that I sacrifice my future to protect their pride. They fully expected me to write a massive unconditional check, hand it over, and fade back into the background so they could continue pretending they were infallible. I didn't write that check. Instead, I gave them a solution wrapped in an invisible, inescapable cage. I hired Arthur, and together we established Vanguard Holdings LLC, a completely anonymous, airtight corporate entity. While Calvin and Brenda assumed I was simply paying off their arrears in an act of obedient filial submission, Vanguard Holdings was executing a highly complex maneuver. We didn't just pay the bank. We legally purchased the distressed note directly from the lender at a premium. We bought the debt, and in doing so, we assumed absolute legal ownership of the property. My parents signed a mountain of restructuring paperwork without bothering to read a single paragraph. They were too frantic to hide their shame, too eager to sweep the foreclosure under the rug, to realize that they were signing over the deed to their precious, sprawling estate. For 7 years, I have been their private zero-interest bank. For 7 years, Calvin and Brenda have proudly mailed a monthly check to a faceless P.O. box registered to Vanguard Holdings, genuinely believing they were slowly paying off a restructured mortgage to a forgiving financial institution. They bragged to their friends about their incredible interest rate. They paraded around their manicured lawns, throwing money at Terrence's endless mistakes, letting him bleed their remaining cash dry, completely oblivious to the fact that the daughter they constantly belittled was the only reason they weren't sleeping in a motel. They didn't own the walls they slept between. They didn't own the roof over their heads. They were simply tenants living on my property, subject to a commercial lease agreement disguised as a loan. And I had allowed them to play rich, watching from the shadows, waiting for the inevitable moment their hubris would outpace their wallets. By redirecting their liquid cash to Terrence, Arthur explained. Pulling me back to the present, they have breached the terms of the agreement. The grace period for a standard residential mortgage does not apply to this commercial lease structure. Being 5 days late grants Vanguard Holdings the immediate, unchallengeable right to initiate eviction proceedings or liquidate the asset. Liquidate. I echoed softly, the word tasting incredibly sweet. They thought they could use my money to keep their golden boy afloat. They thought they could leverage a house they don't even own to secure that massive home equity line of credit Terrence has been begging for. They thought they were invincible. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city below. I had spent my entire childhood being pushed aside, minimized, and treated as an endless resource to be exploited whenever the real family members needed a bailout. My mother had constantly reminded me that I was a disappointment because I chose boardrooms over their brand of performative domesticity. My father had used my success as a shield to protect his son's endless stream of catastrophic failures. They had demanded everything from me while respecting absolutely nothing about me. But the dominoes were finally lined up exactly where I had placed them 7 years ago. The trap was sprung. File the default notice, Arthur, I commanded, keeping my eyes on the horizon. Initiate the liquidation protocol. Let us see exactly how much pride Calvin and Brenda have left when they realize their entire life is owned by the daughter they called a failure. I turned back toward the desk, expecting Arthur to immediately begin typing up the authorizations. Instead, his encrypted tablet emitted a sharp, high-pitched ping, a priority security alert from our external surveillance network. Arthur picked up the device, his eyes rapidly scanning the incoming data feed. The satisfied clinical expression on his face hardened into a look of sharp, urgent focus. He stood up from his chair, bypassing the legal dossier, and walked directly over to where I was standing. Without a word, Arthur slid the glowing tablet across the polished glass desk, pushing it directly into my line of sight. Terrence is at the county clerk's office right now, Arthur said, his voice tight with anticipation. He's trying to push the HELOC through using the power of attorney. The heavy oak doors of the Buckhead Country Club swung open. Friday night had arrived, carrying with it the humid weight of an Atlanta summer and the suffocating pressure of a family reunion. This was Calvin's extravagant 60th birthday gala. The sheer audacity of the event was almost magnificent in its delusion. Exactly 48 hours after discovering they did not own the roof over their heads, my parents were hosting a black tie affair for 150 people. I stepped out of the black town car and handed my keys to the valet. I was intentionally 45 minutes late. I wore a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that draped perfectly against my frame, the deep green fabric catching the ambient light of the club's grand portico. My posture was straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of utter calm. I looked entirely unbothered, a striking contrast to the frantic, panicked energy I knew was vibrating beneath the surface of my family's skin. Entering the grand ballroom was like stepping onto a beautifully decorated battlefield. The space was a testament to Calvin's relentless need for external validation. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the crowded room. Waitstaff in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly through the sea of guests, balancing silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the financial bloodbath I was about to unleash. I scanned the room, instantly recognizing the carefully curated guest list. This was not just a birthday party, it was a strategic assembly of my father's social capital. I saw church elders in their Sunday best, local politicians working the room for future campaign donations, and a vast network of extended family members who had spent decades worshiping at the altar of Calvin's fabricated success. My entrance did not go unnoticed. The emerald silk gown practically demanded attention, but the reactions I received went far beyond simple fashion appreciation. As I glided across the polished hardwood floor toward the bar, I felt the immediate palpable shift in the atmosphere. The forced pleasantries and loud booming laughter seemed to dampen in my immediate vicinity. I reached the bar and smoothly lifted a crystal flute of champagne from a passing tray. Bringing the rim to my lips, I allowed my eyes to casually sweep over the crowd. People were staring. The whispers moved through the room like a sudden chilling draft. Small clusters of relatives leaned in close to one another, their eyes darting in my direction before quickly looking away. Aunts who usually greeted me with overwhelming, suffocating hugs now stood frozen by the buffet tables, their expressions a mixture of shock and thinly veiled disgust. Terrence had kept his promise. The desperate, vicious ultimatum he had texted me had not been an empty threat. He had weaponized the family network. He had spent the last 2 days calling every church elder, every country club associate, and every gossiping aunt, spinning a narrative of absolute victimhood. He had painted me as a ruthless corporate monster actively committing elder abuse against our saintly struggling parents. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the cold liquid ground me. They believed him, of course. It was infinitely easier for them to believe that the quiet, independent daughter had turned wicked than to accept that their beloved charismatic Calvin was a bankrupt fraud. I spotted the architects of my supposed demise holding court near the center of the room. Calvin looked like a cornered animal wearing a tuxedo. He was laughing loudly at a joke told by Councilman Davis, but the sound was hollow, lacking its usual booming resonance. His smile did not reach his eyes. Beside him, Brenda was gripping a glass of white wine so tightly her knuckles were white. She was draped in sequins and pearls, projecting the image of a proud matriarch, but her eyes were darting nervously around the room, tracking every single guest. They were terrified. They were standing in the middle of a room filled with their most important social connections, absolutely paralyzed by the knowledge that I held the detonator to their entire fabricated existence. I continued my slow, deliberate walk through the ballroom, parting the sea of whispering guests without acknowledging a single rumor. I did not offer explanations. I did not rush to defend my character. Let them whisper. Their opinions were as bankrupt as my father's bank accounts. Seeking a momentary reprieve from the heavy glaring stares, I stepped toward the back of the room, moving quietly behind a massive towering floral arrangement of white hydrangeas and cascading orchids. The thick canopy of flowers provided a perfect, unobstructed blind spot. I stood there in the shadows, taking a quiet breath, preparing myself for the inevitable face-to-face confrontation. But before I could move, a voice drifted through the thick curtain of petals and leaves. It was a high-pitched, dramatically trembling voice, a voice perfectly calibrated to elicit maximum sympathy. It was Brittany. I froze, remaining perfectly still in my emerald gown, blending into the shadows behind the display. Through a small gap in the orchids, I had a clear, direct view of my sister-in-law. She was standing in a tight, intimate circle, composed of the most influential women in my parents' congregation, the church aunties. These were the women who controlled the social narrative of our entire community. They were the gatekeepers of gossip, the judges of morality, and the absolute worst people you could ever have aligned against you. And Brittany was playing them like a cheap violin. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "I just do not understand how someone could be so utterly heartless," Brittany sobbed, clutching the arm of Sister Margaret, the head of the church hospitality committee. "After everything Calvin and Brenda have done for her, after they sacrificed their entire lives to raise her." Sister Margaret patted Brittany's hand, her face pinched with righteous indignation. "The Lord sees everything, child. He sees the wickedness in that girl's heart. To try and steal her own parents' home, it is an abomination. It is pure elder abuse." Brittany continued, her voice gaining a desperate theatrical momentum. "Terrence is practically making himself sick trying to protect them. She forged a corporate lien, Margaret. She created a fake holding company to trick Calvin into signing away his equity. Terrence discovered it just in time, but she is threatening to throw Calvin and Brenda out onto the street if we do not surrender all our savings to her." I listened to the absolute staggering audacity of the lie. She was not just spinning a narrative. She was actively projecting her own husband's crimes directly onto me. She was claiming my legitimate life-saving bailout from 7 years ago was a fraudulent scheme positioning Terrence as the valiant savior fighting against my corporate tyranny. "We had to drain the business accounts just to hire lawyers to fight her," Brittany whimpered, pressing the tissue against her cheek. "That is why Terrence has been so stressed. He is sacrificing his own future to stop his sister from destroying this family. Brenda cries herself to sleep every single night. She just keeps asking where she went wrong raising a daughter with such a cold, empty soul." The circle of aunties gasped in unison, a chorus of synchronized outrage. They shook their heads, their heavy jewelry clinking, as they murmured prayers for my swift and terrible judgment. They were entirely captivated by the gospel of Brittany, completely intoxicated by the scandalous drama unfolding right in front of them. I stood behind the floral arrangement, my grip tightening slightly on the stem of my champagne flute. The sheer perfection of the moment was almost overwhelming. They had dug their own graves, climbed inside, and were currently handing me the shovel to bury them alive. They had chosen to escalate a private financial eviction into a public execution of my character. The heavy oak doors of the Buckhead Country Club swung open. Friday night had arrived, carrying with it the humid weight of an Atlanta summer and the suffocating pressure of a family reunion. This was Calvin's extravagant 60th birthday gala. The sheer audacity of the event was almost magnificent in its delusion. Exactly 48 hours after discovering they did not own the roof over their heads, my parents were hosting a black tie affair for 150 people. I stepped out of the black town car and handed my keys to the valet. I was intentionally 45 minutes late. I wore a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that draped perfectly against my frame, the deep green fabric catching the ambient light of the club's grand portico. My posture was straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of utter calm. I looked entirely unbothered, a striking contrast to the frantic, panicked energy I knew was vibrating beneath the surface of my family's skin. Entering the grand ballroom was like stepping onto a beautifully decorated battlefield. The space was a testament to Calvin's relentless need for external validation. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the crowded room. Waitstaff in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly through the sea of guests, balancing silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the financial bloodbath I was about to unleash. I scanned the room, instantly recognizing the carefully curated guest list. This was not just a birthday party. It was a strategic assembly of my father's social capital. I saw church elders in their Sunday best, local politicians working the room for future campaign donations, and a vast network of extended family members who had spent decades worshipping at the altar of Calvin's fabricated success. My entrance did not go unnoticed. The emerald silk gown practically demanded attention, but the reactions I received went far beyond simple fashion appreciation. As I glided across the polished hardwood floor toward the bar, I felt the immediate palpable shift in the atmosphere. The forced pleasantries and loud booming laughter seemed to dampen in my immediate vicinity. I reached the bar and smoothly lifted a crystal flute of champagne from a passing tray. Bringing the rim to my lips, I allowed my eyes to casually sweep over the crowd. People were staring. The whispers moved through the room like a sudden chilling draft. Small clusters of relatives leaned in close to one another, their eyes darting in my direction before quickly looking away. Aunts who usually greeted me with overwhelming, suffocating hugs now stood frozen by the buffet tables, their expressions a mixture of shock and thinly veiled disgust. Terrence had kept his promise. The desperate, vicious ultimatum he had texted me had not been an empty threat. He had weaponized the family network. He had spent the last 2 days calling every church elder, every country club associate, and every gossiping aunt, spinning a narrative of absolute victimhood. He had painted me as a ruthless corporate monster actively committing elder abuse against our saintly struggling parents. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the cold liquid ground me. They believed him, of course. It was infinitely easier for them to believe that the quiet, independent daughter had turned wicked than to accept that their beloved, charismatic Calvin was a bankrupt fraud. I spotted the architects of my supposed demise holding court near the center of the room. Calvin looked like a cornered animal wearing a tuxedo. He was laughing loudly at a joke told by Councilman Davis, but the sound was hollow, lacking its usual booming resonance. His smile did not reach his eyes. Beside him, Brenda was gripping a glass of white wine so tightly her knuckles were white. She was draped in sequins and pearls, projecting the image of a proud matriarch, but her eyes were darting nervously around the room, tracking every single guest. They were terrified. They were standing in the middle of a room filled with their most important social connections, absolutely paralyzed by the knowledge that I held the detonator to their entire fabricated existence. I continued my slow, deliberate walk through the ballroom, parting the sea of whispering guests without acknowledging a single rumor. I did not offer explanations. I did not rush to defend my character. Let them whisper. Their opinions were as bankrupt as my father's bank accounts. Seeking a momentary reprieve from the heavy, glaring stares, I stepped toward the back of the room, moving quietly behind a massive, towering floral arrangement of white hydrangeas and cascading orchids. The thick canopy of flowers provided a perfect, unobstructed blind spot. I stood there in the shadows, taking a quiet breath, preparing myself for the inevitable face-to-face confrontation. But before I could move, a voice drifted through the thick curtain of petals and leaves. It was a high-pitched, dramatically trembling voice, a voice perfectly calibrated to elicit maximum sympathy. It was Brittany. I froze, remaining perfectly still in my emerald gown, blending into the shadows behind the display. Through a small gap in the orchids, I had a clear, direct view of my sister-in-law. She was standing in a tight, intimate circle composed of the most influential women in my parents' congregation, the church aunties. These were the women who controlled the social narrative of our entire community. They were the gatekeepers of gossip, the judges of morality, and the absolute worst people you could ever have aligned against you. And Brittany was playing them like a cheap violin. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "It is just pure, unadulterated jealousy, Margaret," Brittany stage whispered, ensuring her voice projected just far enough to hook the passing waiters. "She has always resented Terrence. She cannot stand that he found a beautiful marriage, that we are building a faithful traditional home, while she sits alone in that cold glass penthouse with nothing but her bank accounts to keep her company." Sister Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Lord have mercy, but to steal a house, Brittany, her own flesh and blood. She manipulated them," Brittany continued, leaning in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss. Calvin thought he was signing routine tax restructuring forms. He trusted his daughter. He had no idea she had created a shadow corporation to hijack the deed. Terrence only found out yesterday when he tried to help his father organize his retirement assets. She has been holding them hostage, Margaret. She is financially abusing two devout, hard-working seniors out of sheer spite. The collective intake of breath from the church aunties was audible over the soft jazz playing across the room. They shook their heads, muttering prayers and condemnations, their eyes wide with the thrill of scandalous high society tragedy. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second, savoring the absolute absurdity of her performance. Then I stepped out from behind the towering wall of white hydrangeas and orchids. The rustle of my emerald silk gown was the only sound announcing my arrival into their tight circle. I did not storm in. I did not raise my voice. I simply glided into the center of the group with the effortless, terrifying calm of an apex predator stepping into the light. The temperature in the circle plummeted instantly. Sister Margaret's eyes bulged, her hand freezing against her pearl necklace. The other women physically recoiled, their faces draining of color, as they realized the subject of their vicious gossip was standing inches away, holding a crystal flute of champagne. Brittany's mouth snapped shut. The manufactured tears vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her flushed, perfectly powdered face rapidly turned the color of ash. "Good evening, ladies," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, honeyed warmth that offered absolutely zero comfort. "Sister Margaret, Miss Clara, it is a pleasure to see you all looking so vibrant tonight. I hope the champagne is to your liking." None of them spoke. They were utterly paralyzed. I turned my gaze slowly to my sister-in-law. "Brittany, I could not help but overhear your fascinating narrative regarding my financial portfolio. You have a remarkable talent for creative fiction. Have you ever considered publishing?" Brittany swallowed hard, taking a slight step backward. Her luxury handbag bumped against the buffet table. We were just discussing the situation with Calvin," she stammered, her voice stripped of its prior theatrical confidence. "The situation that Terrence uncovered." "Uncovered?" I tilted my head, offering a razor-sharp, devastating smile. "That is a very generous verb for a man who marched into a municipal lending office demanding a $200,000 home equity line of credit against a property he holds absolutely zero legal right to." Sister Margaret let out a soft, confused squeak. I kept my eyes locked onto Brittany, stepping 1 inch closer, invading her personal space with calculated precision. "Let us correct the record, shall we?" I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly polite conversational volume. "Because I abhor financial illiteracy, especially when it is broadcasted in public. I did not steal the deed to my parents' home, Brittany. One cannot steal an asset from someone who has already forfeited it to the bank." The church aunties leaned in, the scandal suddenly pivoting in a spectacularly unexpected direction. 7 years ago, I continued articulating every single syllable with immaculate clarity. Calvin and Brenda were exactly 30 days away from a sheriff's auction. They were facing total, catastrophic foreclosure. And do you know why they were facing foreclosure, Brittany? Because my father drained every drop of equity from that house, maxed out his credit lines, and emptied his retirement accounts to fund your husband's spectacular failure of a technology startup. Brittany's breath hitched. She looked wildly around the circle, but the aunties were no longer offering sympathy. They were staring at her with hawkish, judgmental scrutiny. They were bankrupt. I stated the brutal truth, slicing through the elegant ambiance of the country club. They came to me begging for a bailout to save their precious social standing. I did not steal their home. I swooped in through my holding company, purchased the distressed debt directly from the lender at a massive premium, and saved them from living on the street. For 7 years, Calvin has not been paying a mortgage. He has been paying rent. To me. "That is a lie," Brittany whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her absolute terror. "Terrence said it was a trick." "Terrence is a 40-year-old dependent who cannot read a balance sheet," I interrupted smoothly, silencing her instantly. "Which brings me to your earlier comment about my bitter jealousy regarding your beautiful marriage. I find it fascinating that you believe I envy a lifestyle I have been actively financing." Brittany's eyes widened in horror. She shook her head frantically, realizing exactly what I was about to do. I subsidized your lavish wedding, Brittany. I declared, my voice ringing with absolute undeniable authority. When Terrence's credit was too destroyed to secure the venue deposit, Calvin funneled the money from an account I had replenished. Your leased Mercedes, subsidized by the cash flow I freed up by keeping your in-laws out of bankruptcy court. And that massive organic wellness brand you are launching next month, the one you foolishly signed a commercial warehouse lease for. I watched the last remaining drop of color vanish from her face. She was practically hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edge of the linen-draped table. You were counting on that $200,000 equity line to pay your vendors, I said, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive floral perfume radiating off her panicked skin. You tied your personal credit to a business venture funded by imaginary equity. You are not a successful entrepreneur, Brittany. You are a financial liability currently staring down the barrel of a catastrophic personal bankruptcy because the Bank of Jasmine is permanently closed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. The silence in the circle was absolute. The church aunties were staring at Brittany as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. In their world, there was nothing more shameful than false wealth and public ruin. They took a collective, synchronized step away from her, isolating her completely. Brittany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face flushed a violent mottled crimson. She was completely, utterly exposed. The polished, superior facade she had wielded against me for years had been incinerated in less than 3 minutes. She stood there, stammering, stripped of her pride, her assets, and her audience. I offered her one final, chillingly pleasant smile. Enjoy the hors d'oeuvres. I hear the crab cakes are excellent. I turned my back on her, the heavy silk of my gown sweeping gracefully across the floor, leaving her to drown in the suffocating judgment of the women she had just tried to manipulate. The satisfaction was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Every ounce of disrespect I had swallowed over the last decade had been repaid with crushing compound interest. I walked back toward the center of the ballroom, ready to claim a fresh glass of champagne and observe the rest of the evening from a comfortable distance. The room was still buzzing with energy, the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of high society networking creating a steady rhythmic hum. Then, without warning, the live jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The sudden absence of music created a jarring vacuum in the grand space. A sharp, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback echoed through the vaulted ceiling, making several guests wince and cover their ears. At the front of the ballroom, standing beneath the largest crystal chandelier, Calvin tapped his finger aggressively against a silver microphone. He stood tall, projecting the ultimate unbothered aura of a wealthy patriarch, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room for his grand birthday toast. The sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback from the microphone sliced through the ambient noise of the grand ballroom. It was an ugly metallic sound that forced conversations to a grinding halt and made the wealthiest members of the country club wince in unison. At the front of the room, standing beneath the largest and most ostentatious crystal chandelier, Calvin cleared his throat. He tapped the silver mesh of the microphone twice with his index finger, projecting the ultimate unbothered aura of a wealthy patriarch. He was demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room for his grand birthday toast. I remained standing near the back, my emerald silk gown blending into the periphery, watching my father command the space. Calvin possessed a terrifying charisma, a televangelist's ability to completely captivate an audience even when he was entirely devoid of substance. He stood tall in his tailored black tuxedo, adjusting his cuffs with a practiced flick of his wrists. The stage behind him was decorated with cascading white floral arrangements and a massive digital projector screen, currently displaying a looping high-definition slideshow of his fabricated life. There were photos of Calvin standing on the deck of a boat he did not own. Photos of Calvin shaking hands with local politicians he had bribed for access, and perfectly curated family portraits that projected an image of flawless, impenetrable generational wealth. Family! Calvin boomed, his deep, resonant voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Friends, esteemed colleagues, I look out across this magnificent room tonight, and I am filled with an overwhelming sense of humility. The sheer audacity of the word humility falling from his lips was almost physically nauseating. I watched him smile a wide, gleaming expression that reached the farthest corners of the ballroom, but failed entirely to reach his eyes. 60 years, he continued, gripping the microphone stand with both hands. 60 years of life on this earth. When I started out, I had nothing but a vision and an unbreakable work ethic. I built an empire from the absolute ground up. The sweat, the late nights, the sacrifices Brenda and I made to ensure that the Adams name would stand as a pillar of excellence in this community. We did not inherit our success. We forged it with our own two hands. A smattering of polite, admiring applause rippled through the crowd. Councilman Davis raised his glass in a silent toast. Sister Margaret nodded along vigorously, her face a portrait of rapturous agreement. They were eating right out of his hand, completely mesmerized by the mythology of the self-made man. I took a slow, calculated sip of my champagne, letting the cold liquid wash over my tongue. I knew the exact dollar amount of the high-interest loans that had funded his supposed empire. I knew the precise dates he had defaulted on his business lines of credit. I knew the truth that lay buried beneath his expensive tailoring. But a man's true legacy is not measured by the balance in his bank accounts or the square footage of his home. Calvin preached, his tone shifting into a solemn, reverent cadence. True legacy is measured by what he passes down to the next generation. It is about bloodlines. It is about building a foundation of generational wealth that will protect this family long after I am called home. He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his words. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. That is why tonight is not just about celebrating my past, Calvin announced, his voice rising with theatrical triumph. It is about securing our future. I have spent decades building the family estate, turning our home into a sanctuary of prosperity. But a king must eventually prepare his heir to wear the crown. And I can think of no man more deserving, more fiercely dedicated to the Adams family legacy than my son. Calvin extended his arm toward the front row. Terrence, come up here. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. From his seat at the head table, Terrence stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom velvet dinner jacket. He wore a smile of absolute suffocating smugness. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had won a marathon he had not even run. He strode down the center aisle, soaking in the admiration of the crowd, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into a financial slaughterhouse. To the side of the stage, I saw Brittany clapping furiously. Her face was still unnaturally pale from our encounter behind the floral display, and her eyes darted nervously in my direction, but she forced a radiant, supportive smile for the sake of the church aunties watching her. Terrence climbed the steps to the stage and embraced our father. It was a picture-perfect moment of patriarchal succession, manufactured exclusively for the country club audience. Calvin turned back to the microphone, reaching into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He withdrew a large, absurdly ornate antique-style brass key. It was a theatrical prop, a physical manifestation of his delusion. He held it up high so the light from the chandelier could catch the polished metal. "Terrence," Calvin projected, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You have stood by my side through thick and thin. You understand the vision. You understand the blood, sweat, and loyalty required to maintain our standing. In front of God and all our esteemed guests tonight, I am officially passing the torch. I am announcing that Terrence will be taking over the management and ultimate ownership of the family estate." He handed the decorative key to Terrence, who accepted it with a firm, masculine nod, holding it up like a championship trophy. The crowd cheered louder, fully buying into the illusion of a smooth, wealthy transition of power. Calvin let the applause wash over him for a moment before raising his hand to quiet the room. His expression hardened slightly. The televangelist's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, judgmental severity. His eyes scanned the sea of faces sweeping past the politicians and the church elders until they locked directly onto me at the back of the ballroom. The spotlight of his judgment pinned me against the wall. The entire room seemed to follow his gaze, creating a tunnel of focused, whispering attention directed entirely at my emerald gown. "Family is a complex institution," Calvin said into the microphone, his voice dropping an octave, dripping with targeted, unmistakable venom. Some children understand the assignment. They build the family up. They contribute to the legacy. Others allow bitter jealousy to poison their hearts. They try to tear the foundation down out of pure ugly spite. They abandon their duties and disrespect the hands that fed them. He stared right through me, completely intoxicated by his own perceived power. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed he had successfully outmaneuvered me publicly, shaming me into submission, while securing Terrence's future with a house he did not even own. "We do not reward betrayal in this house," Calvin declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "We only reward loyalty." The silence in the ballroom was profound, thick, and suffocating. The guests held their breath, shifting uncomfortably, acutely aware that they were witnessing a brutal public execution of a family member. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I stood perfectly still, letting the full weight of his arrogance settle over me. I felt the cool, smooth glass of my champagne flute against my fingertips. I looked at my father standing on that stage with his golden child holding a fake key to a fake empire, and I felt absolutely nothing but a terrifying surgical calm. I moved to the nearest cocktail table, setting my champagne glass down on the crisp white linen with a quiet, definitive click. I adjusted the silken drape of my emerald gown, squared my shoulders, and stepped out from the shadows. The low hum of whispers ignited immediately as I began to walk. I moved slowly and deliberately up the center aisle. The sound of my heels striking the polished hardwood floor cut through the dead silence of the room with the rhythmic, methodical cadence of a ticking clock. The crowd instinctively parted, stepping back to clear a path, their faces masks of shock, anticipation, and pure, unfiltered dread. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage, ascending the velvet-lined steps, with effortless grace, stepping directly into the blinding glare of Calvin's spotlight. I walked straight past my father, ignoring the sudden, frantic confusion rapidly expanding across his face. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, taking my place exactly where he had stood moments before. I leaned forward, bringing my mouth close to the silver mesh, and calmly tapped the microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp, authoritative thud echoed through the ballroom, commanding absolute silence. I turned my head slightly, directing a cool, detached gaze toward my brother. Terrence was still clutching the absurd, oversized brass prop, his smug smile faltering, replaced by a look of profound, deeply ingrained panic. "That is a beautiful key, Terrence," I said, my voice smooth, amplified, and ringing with a dangerous velvet courtesy. "I truly hope you have a display case for it. It will make a wonderful decorative paperweight." A collective nervous murmur rippled through the front row of tables. Councilman Davis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sister Margaret clutched her pearls, her eyes darting frantically between me and my father. Calvin stepped toward me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "Jasmine, step down from this podium immediately. You are making a spectacle of yourself." I completely ignored him. I reached into the sleek, hidden pocket of my gown and retrieved my smartphone. The device felt heavy and cool in my palm. I unlocked the screen with a single swipe, my thumb hovering over the secure application Arthur had finalized for me just hours ago. "My father is a man who appreciates transparency," I announced to the room, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air of the country club. "He appreciates the harsh, undeniable reality of business. And since we are publicly discussing the transfer of the family estate, I believe it is only fair that all of our esteemed guests have a clear, accurate understanding of the asset in question." I tapped the screen. The wireless casting protocol initiated, instantly overriding the country club's audio-visual system. Behind me, the massive high-definition projector screen flickered aggressively. The carefully curated looping slideshow of Calvin's fabricated life vanished into a stark, blinding wash of static white light. A collective audible gasp erupted from the 150 guests as a high-contrast, perfectly scanned legal document materialized on the enormous screen. It towered over the stage 20 feet high, the bold black text completely unavoidable. At the very top of the screen, in massive, unyielding typography, were the words, "Notice of Default and Commercial Foreclosure." Directly beneath that, stamped with the official red ink of the county clerk, was the transfer of deed. The whispers in the room instantly transformed into a chaotic, buzzing hive of absolute shock. I watched the eyes of the church elders and politicians rapidly scanning the document, reading the irrefutable legal proof of my parents' financial ruin. They read the listed arrears. They read the specific clauses of the commercial lease agreement. And they read the name of the sole, undisputed legal owner of the property printed in bold, undeniable ink, J. Holdings, LLC. Calvin spun around, his eyes locking onto the massive screen. The blood drained from his face so quickly I thought he might physically collapse. His jaw went slack, his hands trembling at his sides. He stared at the name of the holding company, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. The secret he had buried for 7 years was now broadcasted to the entire city. "What is this?" Terrence demanded, his voice cracking, panic fully hijacking his vocal cords. He looked wildly between the screen and our father. "Dad, what is she showing them? What does this mean?" Down in the front row, Brenda let out a choked, horrifying sound, a mixture of a sob and a gasp for air. She slumped back into her chair, covering her face with both hands, the illusion of her wealthy, matriarchal perfection shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I turned back to the microphone, letting my gaze slowly sweep over the stunned, paralyzed crowd, watching the judgment and horror settle onto the faces of the people who had judged me for my entire life. I let them absorb the reality that the man they had been worshipping was nothing more than a bankrupt tenant living on my charity. Finally, I turned my head and looked directly at my parents. They looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. "Dad is entirely right," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority that left absolutely no room for debate. "We only reward loyalty. We do not reward financial incompetence. We do not reward entitlement. And we certainly do not reward funding a 40-year-old man's delusions with money that does not belong to you." I paused, ensuring every single syllable resonated through the vast, silent ballroom. "Which is why I am here to announce that as of 9 a.m. this morning, J. Holdings, LLC has officially foreclosed on the property due to non-payment of the commercial lease. You do not have an estate to pass down, Calvin. You are 30 days away from an eviction notice." I looked at Terrence, who was staring at the decorative key in his hand, as if it had suddenly caught fire. "The Bank of Jasmine is permanently closed." The heavy brass key slipped from Terrence's hand, hitting the polished oak stage with a dull, heavy clank that seemed to echo through the sudden, suffocating silence. For exactly 2 seconds, the ballroom was suspended in absolute shock. Then the entire room erupted into a deafening roar of chaos. Terrence's face twisted from profound confusion into an ugly, volatile mask of pure rage. The realization that his grand coronation had been a meticulously planned public execution finally registered in his underdeveloped mind. He let out a guttural, furious shout and lunged across the stage directly toward me. His hands curled into fists, his expensive velvet dinner jacket straining against his broad shoulders as he charged. He did not make it past the podium. I had not come to this battlefield unprepared. From the heavy velvet drapery lining the wings of the stage, 2 men moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They were my private security detail professionals I had retained specifically for this evening. Dressed in immaculate, dark-tailored suits, they intercepted my brother before he could even close half the distance between us. The larger of the 2 men simply stepped into Terrence's path, planting a massive, immovable hand firmly against my brother's chest. The kinetic force of Terrence's charge was absorbed instantly, stopping him dead in his tracks. The second security operative moved smoothly to Terrence's flank, securing his right arm with a practiced, painless, but entirely unbreakable grip. Terrence struggled violently, his designer shoes slipping against the polished wood as he tried to push past the human wall blocking his path. His face flushed, a dark, mottled purple veins popping along his neck. He looked absolutely pathetic, a grown man throwing a physical temper tantrum because his imaginary empire had just been legally dissolved. Down in the front row, the spell of shock finally broke over Brittany. She leaped from her chair, her face contorted in panic. "You cannot do this!" Brittany screamed, her shrill voice piercing through the ambient roar of the panicked crowd. She pointed a trembling finger up at the stage, her luxury jewelry catching the light. "This is completely illegal. You are stealing their home. You are a criminal. Someone call the police on her." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, the proximity causing a low, commanding hum to vibrate through the massive speakers flanking the ballroom. I strongly suggest you keep the word criminal out of your mouth tonight, Brittany. I warned, my voice cutting through the noise with the smooth, icy precision of a scalpel, and I strongly suggest everyone else takes a seat and listens very closely, because I am about to deliver a brief lesson in basic mathematics and I demand your absolute attention. The sheer terrifying calm in my voice forced the room back into submission. The frantic whispering died down. The guests slowly lowered themselves back into their seats, their eyes locked onto the stage, completely captivated by the destruction of the Addams family mythology. My sister-in-law seems to be under the delusion that I have committed a crime, I stated, scanning the sea of faces before me. Let us look at the cold, hard, undisputed math. 7 years ago, Calvin and Brenda Addams were absolutely, unequivocally bankrupt. They were 30 days away from the bank chaining the doors of their precious estate shut. They had drained every liquid asset they possessed to fund a disastrous technology venture spearheaded by the very man they just tried to crown as their heir. I paused, letting the reality of Terrence's massive hidden failure wash over the crowd. I could see the church elders exchanging severe judgmental glances. They came to me, the daughter they spent 3 decades calling a bitter disappointment, and they demanded a bailout. I continued articulating every single consonant. And I gave it to them. I purchased the distressed debt. I paid the bank in full. For 84 consecutive months, I have maintained the property taxes, the structural insurance, and the municipal fees. I have poured exactly $252,000 of my own hard-earned capital into that property just to keep a roof over my parents' heads. $252,000 to maintain their illusion of wealth. The collective gasp from the audience was loud and visceral. The number hung in the air, a massive, undeniable weight that crushed Calvin's entire opening speech about self-made generational wealth into fine dust. I asked for nothing in return but basic respect and the agreed-upon monthly lease payments. I said, my gaze dropping directly onto Calvin, who was currently slouching against the edge of the stage, looking small and thoroughly defeated. But even that was too much to ask from this family. Instead of paying their lease, Calvin and Brenda deliberately defaulted. They took the money they owed me, and they attempted to illegally leverage a house they do not own to secure a $200,000 credit line. I turned my attention back to Brittany, who had sunk into her chair, her face buried in her hands. And do you know what that massive influx of stolen capital was destined for? I asked the room, infusing my voice with a heavy dose of lethal mockery. It was not going toward a valid investment. It was not going toward a college fund or a medical emergency. My parents defaulted on their home so they could gift the equity to Terrence, who planned to use every single cent to fund his wife's luxury organic vanity blog. The reaction was instantaneous. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted from shocked fascination to active hostile judgment. The whispers that ignited this time were not directed at me. They were sharp, furious, and aimed squarely at the front row. The church aunties, the very same women who had been comforting Brittany just 20 minutes ago, were now glaring at her with unapologetic disgust. Councilman Davis leaned away from Calvin as if the man were carrying a plague. The community was turning. They realized they had been lied to, manipulated, and forced to play as extras in a fraudulent display of wealth. The golden boy had bankrupted his parents for a vanity project, and the parents had happily enabled it. I watched the hostility radiate through the crowd, an invisible wave of social condemnation crashing down entirely on Calvin, Brenda, Terrence, and Brittany. Their kingdom was in ashes, but I was not quite finished. I stepped away from the acrylic podium, leaving the microphone behind. The heavy silence of the room followed me as I unclasped the delicate gold clasp of my emerald silk clutch. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, tri-folded stack of heavy bond paper. The document felt crisp against my fingertips. I told you all earlier that my sister-in-law should be very careful about casually throwing the word criminal around. I said, projecting my voice without the aid of the sound system. The acoustics of the vaulted ceiling carried my words perfectly. Because while a commercial foreclosure is a standard legal business proceeding, what my brother has been doing in his spare time certainly is not. Terrence stopped struggling against the security guards. His eyes locked onto the folded paper in my hand, his pupils dilating in sheer primal terror. He knew exactly what I was holding. I descended the velvet-lined stairs of the stage, my heels clicking softly against the wood. I did not walk toward my parents or my brother. I walked directly toward the very center of the front row, stopping precisely in front of a broad-shouldered man with a distinguished spray of silver hair at his temples. Uncle Marcus. Marcus was my mother's oldest brother. He was also a highly decorated 30-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, currently serving as a precinct captain. He was the undisputed moral compass of our extended family, a man whose respect Calvin had spent decades desperately trying to maintain. Marcus did not suffer fools, and he absolutely loathed a liar. Uncle Marcus, I said, my tone shifting from cold authority to genuine familial respect. I apologized for ruining the evening's festivities, but since Calvin wanted to gather the entire family to celebrate his legacy, I feel it is my duty to ensure the family patriarchs have all the relevant facts regarding the new head of the estate. I held out the document. Marcus looked at me, his sharp, analytical eyes searching my face for a fraction of a second before he reached out and took the papers. He unfolded them slowly, smoothing the creases against his knee. He reached into his breast pocket, retrieved a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, and slipped them onto his face. The entire ballroom held its collective breath watching the veteran police captain read. It was an official, highly detailed police report. It outlined a meticulous, multi-tiered investigation into aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. It detailed exactly how Terrence Adams had illegally acquired his father's social security number, forged Calvin's signature on a series of financial documents, and used his elderly parents' remaining clean credit profile to secretly lease the $90,000 luxury SUV parked outside with the valet. I watched the muscles in Uncle Marcus's jaw tighten. The deep lines on his forehead deepened into deep, furious trenches. He read the exact dates, the fraudulent loan origination numbers, and the digital paper trail that led directly back to Terrence's IP address. Marcus slowly lowered the document. He took off his glasses, folding them with deliberate, terrifyingly slow precision. He looked past me, his gaze bypassing the stage, entirely locking onto Terrence with a look of such absolute, unadulterated disgust that it made my brother physically recoil. Terrence's golden boy facade did not just crack, it completely and utterly disintegrated in real time. He slumped forward, the fight draining entirely out of his body. The security guards released him, recognizing he was no longer a physical threat. Terrence dropped to his knees right there on the stage, burying his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled groan. He had been stripped of everything. His father's money, his fake success, and the respect of the only men in the family who truly mattered. The low hum of the crowd transformed into an uproar. Relatives were standing up from their tables, pointing and shouting. The politicians were actively edging toward the nearest exits, desperate to put distance between themselves and the radioactive fallout of a fraud scandal. Suddenly, my personal space was aggressively invaded. Calvin and Brenda rushed me, stumbling over the hem of Brenda's sequined gown. They practically threw themselves in front of me, physically blocking my path back down the aisle. Their faces were frantic, glistening with a thick layer of cold sweat. "Jasmine, please," Calvin stammered, his booming, arrogant voice reduced to a desperate, raspy whisper. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, his eyes darting wildly toward Uncle Marcus, who was now standing up, his massive frame radiating pure authority. "Please, sweetheart, you have made your point. You have won. Let us take this to a private room. We can go to the manager's office. We can fix this. Just stop doing this in front of everyone." Brenda grabbed my forearm, her acrylic nails digging into my skin. "You are destroying the family, Jasmine," she sobbed, her makeup running in dark, jagged tracks down her cheeks. "Everyone is looking at us. They are taking pictures. Please, I am begging you. Let us take this behind closed doors. Do not do this to us." I looked down at Brenda's trembling hands. Her manicured acrylic nails dug into my forearm with a desperate, pathetic strength. She was weeping openly now, the carefully applied cosmetics smearing into dark, jagged lines down her face. Calvin stood beside her, his broad shoulders hunched, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. They looked exactly like what they were, two frauds whose house of cards had finally collapsed. I smoothly but forcefully detached my arm from my mother's grip. I took a deliberate step back, placing a physical boundary between their desperation and my victory. A private room. I repeated the question, projecting my voice clearly across the dead silence of the ballroom. You did not request a private room when Calvin was standing on this very stage, commanding the attention of 150 guests, just to call me a bitter, spiteful disappointment. You did not want privacy when you attempted to humiliate me in front of our entire community. I looked at Calvin. The arrogant patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell. You demanded an audience for my execution, I stated, my tone devoid of any sympathy. It is only fair that you keep that same audience for your own ruin. I refuse to hide your shame behind closed doors to protect a social standing that has not existed for 7 years. I turned slightly and signaled to the lead security operative standing near the edge of the stage. He stepped forward immediately, producing a thick, heavy manila envelope from inside his tailored suit jacket. He handed it to me with a respectful nod and stepped back into the shadows. I held the envelope out toward Brenda. She stared at the thick brown paper as if I were offering her a live explosive. She shook her head frantically, refusing to reach out, her hands pressed tightly against her chest. When she did not take it, I simply opened my fingers and let the heavy package drop. It landed on the polished hardwood floor right at her designer heels with a dull, heavy thud. Inside that envelope, I announced, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the vast room, is a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises. You are officially being evicted from my property. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your fabricated lives and hand over the keys. Brenda let out a sharp, agonized wail. She collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her arms. Calvin stared at the envelope on the floor, his entire body trembling. The reality of their situation was absolute. They had no assets, no savings, and no home. I turned my gaze away from my weeping parents and locked eyes with my brother. Terrence was still kneeling on the stage, his tailored velvet jacket rumpled, his golden boy image utterly destroyed. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes resembling a trapped animal. However, I continued, my voice dripping with cold, calculated mockery. Calvin made a very moving speech tonight about family legacy and the responsibilities of an heir, so I am willing to offer an alternative solution. I took a slow step toward Terrence, forcing him to crane his neck upward. Terrence is the newly crowned head of the Addams family estate, I proclaimed to the captivated crowd. He holds the decorative key. He carries the torch. So Terrence, if you wish to protect your legacy and keep your elderly parents from sleeping on the street next month, the solution is quite simple. You can take over the commercial lease. You can pay me the fair market rent of $4,500 on the first of every month. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. Terrence opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face flushed a violent, sickly red. He looked wildly at Calvin, then down at the floor, then out toward the crowd. He was completely paralyzed. Let us see exactly how much your legacy is worth, Terrence. I challenged him, my tone razor sharp. Step up. Be the patriarch Calvin raised you to be. Write the check right now. He could not write a check. He could not even afford the gas in his fraudulently leased luxury SUV. The silence stretched on, heavy and brutal, confirming his absolute pathetic inadequacy to every single person in the room. Uncle Marcus stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, watching Terrence squirm with an expression of sheer disgust. The community elders muttered among themselves, shaking their heads at the spectacular failure of the Addams men. Then movement near the front table caught my eye. Brittany had been standing frozen near the floral displays, her face ashen as she watched her husband's total destruction. She had married Terrence for the image. She had married him for the perceived wealth, the country club access, and the endless stream of capital she believed would fund her lavish lifestyle and vanity businesses. I watched her highly calculating mind process the crash in real time. The house was gone. The secret bank of Jasmine was permanently closed. Her husband was not a wealthy heir. He was a broke dependent fraud who was currently staring down multiple felony charges for identity theft. The social standing she craved was completely incinerated. She was now married to a criminal liability with zero assets. Brittany looked at Terence still kneeling pathetically on the stage. She looked at Calvin and Brenda weeping in disgrace. Then her eyes met mine. There was no fight left in her. There were no theatrical tears or desperate screaming. There was only the cold, hard realization that the free ride was entirely over. Without speaking a single word, Brittany raised her left hand. She gripped her large diamond engagement ring and the matching diamond wedding band. With a slow, deliberate motion, she slid the expensive rings off her finger. She picked up Terrence's abandoned half-full crystal champagne flute from the linen-draped table. She held her bare hand over the glass and simply let the diamonds fall. The heavy rings hit the bottom of the crystal flute with a sharp, piercing clink that cut through the silence of the ballroom. Brittany did not look back at her husband. She turned on her heel, her silk dress swishing against her legs, and walked straight down the center aisle. She moved with a fast, determined stride, ignoring the stares of the church aunties and the whispers of the politicians. She pushed through the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, stepping out into the humid Atlanta night, leaving Terrence and his completely ruined legacy behind forever. 3 months is a remarkably short amount of time for an entire kingdom to fall, but reality has a way of working swiftly once the illusion is shattered. The fallout from Calvin's 60th birthday gala was absolute ruthless and entirely self-inflicted. I did not have to lift another finger after that night. I simply stepped back and let the sheer weight of their financial incompetence crush them. Terrence's spectacular demise was almost poetic. The golden child, the chosen heir to the fabricated Adams legacy, was currently sleeping on a lumpy futon in the unfinished basement of a former fraternity brother. Uncle Marcus had not ignored the police report I handed him. He executed his duties with the cold precision of a veteran captain who despised being made a fool. The $90,000 luxury SUV was repossessed from the country club parking lot before the valet had even finished his shift. Terrence was facing multiple felony charges for identity theft and wire fraud, his spotless reputation incinerated overnight. Brittany, ever the calculating opportunist, did not wait around for the sinking ship to hit the ocean floor. True to the silent promise she made when she dropped her wedding rings into a glass of champagne, she filed for divorce the very next morning. She emptied the remaining operational funds from her doomed wellness blog, packed her designer bags, and relocated to a luxury condominium funded by a new wealthy backer she had met at a Pilates studio. She blocked Terrence's number and scrubbed every photo of the Addams family from her social media profiles. The free ride was over, and she had simply transferred to a different vehicle. As for Calvin and Brenda, the 30-day eviction notice was executed without a single hitch. Terrence predictably failed to produce the $4,500 required to keep his parents in their home. He could not even afford the filing fees for a bankruptcy attorney. My parents were forced to pack up 3 decades of gaudy fake wealth and relocate to a cramped, loudly vibrating 2-bedroom apartment situated directly parallel to Interstate 85. The gentle, manicured silence of the Buckhead suburbs was replaced by the relentless, deafening roar of commercial trucks passing by their single-pane windows at all hours of the night. Their social capital vanished instantly. The church aunties led by Sister Margaret excommunicated them with brutal efficiency. Calvin's calls to the local politicians he had spent years bribing went straight to voicemail. In the high society circles of Atlanta, there is no sin greater than being exposed as a fraud. They were pariahs isolated in their tiny apartment, drowning in the consequences of their own arrogance. I am sitting at the heavy marble desk in my penthouse office, finalizing the quarterly projections for my holding company when my personal cell phone vibrates against the polished stone. The caller ID displays Brenda's name. I let it ring. It rolls over to voicemail a moment later, triggering an audio file notification on my screen. I tap the play icon. Brenda's voice fills the quiet luxury of my office. Her tone is entirely stripped of the haughty, matriarchal superiority she had wielded against me for my entire life. She is weeping a wet, desperate, pathetic sound. She is sobbing about the noise of the highway, the unpaid utility bills, and the sheer humiliation of her new reality. She begs for forgiveness, stammering through a frantic apology, realizing far too late which child actually held their lives together. I listen to exactly 5 seconds of the crying before hitting the delete button. The silence that follows the deleted voicemail is pristine and profoundly peaceful. I lock my phone, slip it into my blazer pocket, and leave my office for the final appointment of the day. I am standing on the sprawling, multi-tiered back balcony of my parents' former estate. The property is completely unrecognizable. Over the past 90 days, I had a team of premium contractors gut the house down to its foundational studs. Calvin's oppressive dark mahogany paneling, Brenda's suffocating velvet drapes, and the dated ostentatious chandeliers have all been ripped out and thrown into an industrial dumpster. The space has been modernized, opened up, and professionally staged with minimalist high-end furniture. It looks exactly like what it is, a premium, multi-million-dollar asset primed for a highly competitive real estate market. And the market responded perfectly. Just an hour ago, sitting at the massive quartz kitchen island that replaced Brenda's cramped cooking space, I signed the final closing documents. I sold the estate to a tech executive relocating from Silicon Valley for a massive, unprecedented cash profit. I am not using that capital to buy a vanity project or a depreciating luxury vehicle. Every single dollar of that profit is immediately being injected into J Holdings, LLC, to fund the nationwide expansion of my public relations firm. The Atlanta office is already dominating the regional market, and by the end of the fiscal year, I will have fully operational branches in New York and Los Angeles. I am turning the brick and mortar of their fake legacy into the fuel for my very real, undeniable empire. I swirl the deep crimson liquid in my crystal glass, taking a slow sip of a vintage Bordeaux I purchased to celebrate the closing. The wine is complex, heavy, and absolutely flawless. I look out over the manicured tree line, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the jagged silhouette of the Atlanta skyline. The sky is painted in brilliant strokes of gold violet and bruised orange. Standing there in the quiet twilight, I take a moment to truly reflect on the concept of family inheritance. Calvin had stood on a stage in a rented tuxedo and tried to use the idea of a legacy as a weapon to destroy me. He wanted to strip me of my worth, humiliate me in front of our community, and secure a future for a son who possessed absolutely zero ambition. He thought he was taking everything away from me. But looking out at the city I am actively conquering, I realized the profound truth of that night. The greatest inheritance my parents ever gave me was not money, property, or a prestigious family name. The greatest gift they ever bestowed upon me was showing me exactly who they were. By attempting to publicly execute my character, they completely severed the invisible toxic strings of obligation that had bound me to them for 3 decades. They freed me from the suffocating burden of their expectations. I no longer had to shrink myself to make Terrence look taller. I no longer had to quietly fund their extravagant illusions of grandeur. Their betrayal was the ultimate liberation, allowing me to finally take all the energy, capital, and loyalty I had wasted on them and invest it entirely in myself. The sun finally dips below the horizon, pulling the last fading rays of light from the sky. The cool evening air settles over the balcony. I finish the last drop of my wine, savoring the rich, lingering finish on my palate. I turn around and walk back inside the pristine, empty house. I set the crystal glass on the kitchen counter, tap the master switch to turn off the recessed lighting, and pull the heavy front door shut until I hear the firm, satisfying click of the deadbolt. I walk down the driveway toward my waiting car, stepping out into a life that is entirely, unapologetically mine. The greatest lesson from this ordeal is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and you cannot buy respect from people committed to misunderstanding you. For years, she shrank herself to fund her family's grand illusions, desperately hoping to finally earn their love. Instead, she learned that true security never comes from accommodating toxic behavior. By setting unbreakable boundaries and refusing to remain a victim, she reclaimed her power entirely. Her journey proves your worth is never defined by those who exploit you. True freedom begins the moment you stop seeking their validation and unapologetically start investing in your own future. Share your own story of setting hard boundaries with toxic relatives in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more empowering content.